And here's what we're going to be learning today. Number one, we're going to have to introduce some basic terminology. Essentially, what this is going to be focusing on today is applying a lot of terminology from what we'll call the colonial discourse or post-colonial studies to the Jewish people, to understand who we are, what we've been through, how some of these concepts, some of these terms that are thrown around in academia and in different activist circles actually do apply to the Jewish people. So we're going to start by going through some very basic terminology to make sure that we're all on the same page. And later, of course, we're going to talk about how these terms apply specifically to the Jewish people. From there, we are going to try to understand what pre-colonial Hebrew civilization looked like. It's something we don't talk about enough, but the pre-colonial Hebrew civilization, what was that? How did it function? How did it see the world? And that's important. So please, stick with us for that. Then we're going to talk about the processes and layers of Jewish colonization. It's not simple. It's not as simple as it is for other people, and you'll see why. And then we're going to talk about Jewish decolonization efforts to decolonize the Jewish experience over the centuries. And then we're going to be talking about Jewish decolonization today. So before we get started, question we have to ask ourselves is, what are Jews? Are we a culture? Are we a nation?
Yeah.
Are we a race, ethnicity, religion? What are Jews?
So this is actually a question that I ask myself often, and before I go into the process that went through my mind to find that answer for myself, we're going to be breaking down these terms, and these terms are often used in intellectual spaces on college campuses. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So we use these terms often on college campuses, so we have to understand that when we speak today in intellectual platforms, whether it be in the workplace or on a college campus or online, a lot of times these words are being used and we need to understand what they mean, and then we're going to go into a deeper explanation as to how they apply to ourselves. So are we a culture? Are we a nation? Are we a race? Are we an ethnicity? Are we a religion? I'm sure a lot of Jews have called Am Yisrael, the nation, the people, all these different names. For me, growing up, I had my grandparents born in different countries. Each one of my grandparents were born in a different country: Algeria, Morocco, Poland, and Belgium. And I was born in France, second generation born in France, then moved to Israel, then moved to Miami. And particularly growing up in Miami, there was many different cultures, and no one really identified as American. Everyone was Argentinian, Venezuelan, Colombian, Haitian. This is a story I talk a lot about because it's something that sort of led me to the path today of finding out who I am. And because everyone referred to themselves something else, I was always imposed a different identity depending on who I was talking to. So in Miami, I was labeled the French kid. In France, I was the American cousin. In Jewish day school, I was being told to be Ashkenazi, although I was raised completely Sephardi. I was a Jew, I was Israeli, I was Moroccan, I was Polish, I was Belgian, I was Algerian. And to me, I didn't really relate to all these labels and titles because, yeah, I was born in France, but I left when I was 3, and that's not my people, that's not my history, that's not my culture. It just so happened to be where my parents were born. And after experiencing, I guess, my first dose of anti-Semitism at a very young age, which is not necessarily, we don't need to get into that story, but that moment, basically, we were kicked off of a bus in London with my family because they found out that we were Jewish. And when that happened, I realized in that moment that it didn't matter where I was born, grew up, lived, and traveled to, I was a Jew. And Jews definitely have a culture. We're not a race, because this concept of a race, of dividing people based on pigmentations or genetic features, is a man-made concept, and it has nothing to do with Jews because historically we always came in many different colors, so it's not a race. A religion, I would say it's not a religion either, because a religion is defined as a belief system in a god, deity, book, or a prophet. And if you don't believe in the god, deity, book, or a prophet, then you're not a religion. So religion is just a belief system for any people. And Judaism has definitely a belief system within it. But even if you don't believe in that belief system, if you don't accept the Torah and Hashem, you're still a Jew, not any more, not any less than any other Jew. So it's not a religion because it's not just a belief system, and it's not for any people, it's for one people. An ethnicity, it's like a, culture and language from a particular region. I think it's a term that's way too broad for who we are. We can say that an ethnicity can be a Semitic ethnicity or a Middle Eastern ethnicity. So it's something way broader than just particularly our civilization and our nation. So I think nation is the best word. Civilization, nation, a people that had a civilization and a specific piece of land that they were native to. And when we left that civilization, which at the time was called Judea, we created a portable suitcase called Judaism. And ism is a man-made thing where we packed in our culture, our values, our history, and our tradition, and passed it down the dor vador, generation to generation, with the aspiration of one day coming back home. And that's who the Jewish people are.
I would add that, and we're going to unpack all those things that Rudy just said. I think that was very well said. And for those who might feel that, they didn't fully get it or fully understand, we'll probably get more detailed as we continue. But all of these social constructs, culture, nation, race, ethnicity, religion, they came into the world after the children of Israel, meaning we existed, our identity existed in this world before all of these terms. So it's very problematic to try to fit ourselves into boxes that were created by other peoples, other cultures, other civilizations, after we were already in the world. So moving forward, let's get started. Number one, let's try to just break down some basic terminology. We don't need to really apply it to the Jewish people per se right now. It's just important that we understand these concepts. So as we continue, we could use them, and they could be really valuable tools, in my opinion, when it comes to understanding ourselves or, breaking down our own identity. The first is colonialism. So colonialism is quite simply the policy of a nation seeking to extend or retain its authority over other people or territories, generally with the aim of developing or exploiting them to the benefit of the colonizing nation. And colonialism has been justified historically as the extension of civilization, self-ascribing racial and cultural superiority to the Western world. Colonialism, very simple. Then you have settler colonialism, and that's colonialism that seeks to replace the original population of a colonized territory with a new society of settlers. That's an important term in regards to the discourse surrounding Israel today. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot. We're going to have to address it, obviously, but we're not going to address it yet. Imperialism. Imperialism is direct military control by one nation, generally an empire, over a foreign territory. And it's driven by the need for capitalist economies to constantly expand investment, material resources, and manpower. That's essentially what drives imperialism, the fact that in the capitalist system, economies grow, and ultimately these economies grow beyond the borders of the nation itself. And of course, in capitalist societies, there's a symbiotic relationship between what we'll call the capitalist class and the people who make governmental policy, whether it's just through lobbyists, for example, or campaign financing. Those who fund political campaigns have a lot of influence over politicians and the policies that they pursue. Cultural imperialism. That's actually a local example. It's the extension of the influence or dominance of one nation's culture over others, usually through the exportation of cultural commodities such as film, music, etc., art books, television shows. And I'm sure that a lot of us don't even realize it, the extent to which our values or our worldview are often shaped by things we see on television or things we see in the movies. That's important to keep in mind, that there are industry, and like, for example, it's said that a lot of films, especially action films, are reported to get special discounts using like U.S. military equipment, which is necessary when you're making a big budget action film. Often they use a lot of military equipment. So long as they portray the U.S. military in a positive light. So that's just like an example of not only how film or music or art might shape our worldview, but how there's actually agenda that that's at play often with these things. Hegemony. It's indirect political control by one nation over another. Things aren't as simple as just boots on the ground anymore. And the dictation of the internal politics and societal character of a subordinate nation by a dominant nation. So think about how certain dominant nations are able to control the policies of smaller, weaker, subordinate nations in today's world without having to invade, without having to occupy with boots in the ground or like structures of dominance, military structures of dominance, but really through just the relationships that those countries have.
This has a lot to do with why I'm against the U.S. foreign aid to Israel, which we'll break down later. But keep in mind, if you've ever heard me talk about this, it has a lot to do with this term.
Yeah. Then you have cultural hegemony, which is the imposition of a worldview and value system by the ruling class on a society as the accepted cultural norm. I think we do have that in Israeli society. The three politicians chosen in this picture are politicians that are very much associated with Israel's westernized ruling class, that often seek to set a cultural norm and a value norm on society that all of society is supposed to subscribe to. I think, Rudy would agree that the people of Israel, the nation of Israel, is made up of different tribes, different political camps, different sociocultural camps that all have something true and something valuable to express that make up this kind of like mosaic. We're not a homogenous nation. In fact, I would say part of our authentic culture is machloket. You've heard the joke, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. That's part of our culture. That's part of who we are. The problem is when one tribe gains dominance at the expense of the others and tries to make their worldview and their value system the accepted cultural norm for the entire society. Meaning, if you take all the tribes of Israel today, all the different socio-cultural groups, political groups within Israeli society, there has to be certain values or certain cultural norms or a certain ethos that's the glue that binds us all together. And right now, the way it works in Israeli society is the elites of, that make up a very small percentage of Israeli society have declared themselves the glue or believe they're entitled to the glue.
And they control the media, they control journalism, they control any form of outward expression for the most part. And, they usually are those that are controlling the more technologically advanced and cities that have a lot of international influence, like Tel Aviv and places in the Merkaz. But I think just to go a little bit further on the tribes, you're talking about ideologic tribes. Once upon a time, we were physical tribes, and today we've become these ideologic tribes. You have the right, you have the left, you have the secular, you have the religious. And what we have to understand is not one of them is the truth. They are all parts of the truth. And each one of them is a sort of puzzle piece to a greater image of what we truly are. And they all bring something very relevant to the conversation. So when it comes to the right is what's important for the right is security and identity, things that are very important. For the left, it's more humanity and rights and justice and liberation and talks about stuff like that. And that's also very important. Why does one contradict the other? And when we look at the secular and the religious, why do they contradict? The religious are talking about being connected to something spiritual and keeping our traditions and keeping our values and being true to who we are and being separate. But at the same time, the secular is saying, yeah, we are separate, but we're also not all the way separate because we're also a part of the world, and we have to be interconnected with the rest of the world and relevant with the rest of the world and doing business and trading and learning math and science and different things that are not just spiritual. And these are actually all elements of one greater truth, which is what we are. And it is a part of a conversation that we have to figure out now, because when Israel was reborn in 1948, it's like a child being born. When a child is born, it is weak and needs its parents to defend it, to give it food and shelter, care. And at some point you grow up and you get into an adolescence age. And in the adolescence age, everyone has their own rebellion in their own way, but sometimes adolescent teenagers, they dye their hair a different color, and they, you know, scream at their parents, and everyone has their own process, and it's not a bad process. It's a process of trying to find your individuality and finding your voice and finding how you want to express yourself. And that is sort of the stage that we exist in today, where we need to find out what is our mission statement. Who are we as a people? Who are we as a nation? What are we supposed to do? Where have we come back to, and what and for what? And that is kind of the question that our generations needs to ask ourselves today.
Right, and I think that we should be unpacking all of that. And of course, when Rudy talks about the right and the left, he's talking about how those terms are used internally in Israeli society, not how those terms are used in the rest of the world. And we should, even, you know, depending on how deep we get to go tonight, I think we should probably, I hope we get to ask the question and address the question of, to what extent are these terms, secular, religious, right, left, external to us? To what extent are those even terms, things that we're adopting as part of a foreign lens when we look at ourselves or look at our society? But overall, in terms of the content of what Rudy says, I agree. Like, I think the point Rudy's making is a correct point. All right, now, neocolonialism. And this is also relevant to our situation. It's using capitalism, globalization, economic aid, and or cultural imperialism to influence or indirectly control a country in lieu of direct military control, like imperialism, or indirect political control, like hegemony. And that's an obvious question. I think somebody asked in the chat, you know, Rudy, can you talk about your opposition to taking U.S. aid? And I think the opposition would come from control, this issue of, you know, nothing's free.
Yeah, well, we have to understand what that means to get this aid, because a lot of times, a lot of the Jewish community, at least, was raised with, it's amazing that America is such a big ally to Israel, and one of the things that they do is that they give this sum of money to Israel every year. But the reality, if you break that down and you look deeper, it's not actually a sum of money given to Israel, it's credit. Now, what that means is that Israel every year has to use their credit into buying weapons from the American military. So that forces all of our weapons to be created in America rather than Israel. So I was actually one of the first drafts in the IDF to be given American boots, whereas before we had Israeli boots, and that Israeli company was put out of business because Israel had to use the credit that it was given from the US in the US. And it comes with a lot of strings attached as well. We cannot sell all our military technology to any other country unless it's approved by the US. We cannot buy any other military technology from anyone else unless it comes from the US. And today, if you look at our bullets, our planes, our tanks, our magazines, our guns, even our bases, and sometimes our uniforms and elements of everything within the army, not every single thing, but the vast majority is manufactured and made in the US. Now, what happens if the U.S. one day becomes anti-Israel? What happens if the U.S. one day falls and is no longer a civilization? Now, I'm not saying that that's going to happen, but it's a likely scenario that it can happen. Every country, a nation, empire rises and falls. So if that day is to come, why do we need to be completely dependent on a country that is giving us those things? And furthermore, why aren't those economies being built in Israel? Those are businesses that we should be creating in Israel. Now, a lot of people say, well, it's billions of dollars and Israel doesn't have the economy. Well, I answer back to them that if we actually created and manufactured that in Israel, then we'd be making a lot more money than the credit we were receiving from the US and becoming completely dependent on the US. Now, I'm not against the US, but I'm against Israel being dependent on any country, including the US.
Yeah. No, I think those are all fair points. You don't want, first of all, you can't be dependent and independent at the same time, and that's really how neocolonialism works. It's a way to make us dependent and prevent us from being independent. You know, next week is Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel Independence Day, where we celebrate our independence, and we don't want to just celebrate it because we put up a flag. We want to be independent. We want to be an independent nation that can have lots of friends around the world, but is not subordinate, and certainly, I think, as Rudy said, won't get dragged down with some other empire's decline. So then we have post-colonialism, and that's really where we're getting into the meat of tonight's topic. Post-colonialism is the study of the cultural legacy and lasting impact of colonization on former colonies, focusing on the human consequences of the control and exploitation of colonized people and their lands. So this is a study to understand how a people is affected by colonization, not just in terms of their lands and their economies and their national independence, but really beyond that. There are psychological consequences. There are, long-lasting material consequences. Especially when education systems that might be foreign to a civilization or economic models or what have you. So post-colonialism is really the study of this cultural legacy and the lasting impact of colonization on the colonized people. And that's really important, for us to understand ourselves and our experience and what's happened to us in history and what our potential is today. We really need to understand how this works and how this has worked. Then you have decolonization, which the Vision movement is very interested in, and that's the process of undoing colonialism and deconstructing colonial ideologies of the superiority and privilege of Western thought. This involves dismantling structures that perpetuate the status quo and addressing unbalanced power dynamics. And then we have indigenous decolonization. That's actually a picture of Frantz Fanon, who authored a few books, but The Wretched of the Earth is one of his most important books, I think, and it's a book everybody should check out. Frantz Fanon is considered one of the leading thinkers in the post-colonial discourse, and the indigenous decolonization is the ongoing theoretical and political processes used to contest and reframe narratives about indigenous communities, histories, and the effects of colonial expansion, genocide, and cultural assimilation. Now, this involves valuing and revitalizing indigenous knowledge and approaches while weeding out Western biases or assumptions that have impacted indigenous ways of being. This process of indigenous colonization also adopts a critical stance toward Western-centric research practices and discourse seeking to reposition knowledge within indigenous cultural practices. And I'll tell you why I think this is really important. Some indigenous studies scholars have characterized decolonial work that relies on structures of Western political thought as paradoxically furthering cultural dispossession. And these scholars have advocated for the use of independent spiritual, social, and physical rejuvenation, even if these practices don't easily translate into political recognition the way we classically understand. And beyond the theoretical dimensions of indigenous decolonization work, direct action campaigns, healing journeys, embodied social struggles for decolonization are frequently associated with ongoing native resistance struggles and disputes over land rights, ecological extraction, political marginalization, sovereignty. And what this basically means for our purposes, in my opinion, is that the work of decolonization, when applied to the Jewish people, really requires that we try to work within the context of the worldview, value system, and historiography of the pre-colonial Hebrews. And it's important for me, I think it is paradoxical. We're taking all these tools, the whole decolonization discourse, and we're using those tools to liberate ourselves, decolonize Jewish identity. And I think it's okay to take tools from elsewhere, and we'll probably get into that when we talk about pre-colonial Hebrew civilization. But it's really important to me and to Rudy and the Vision movement that when we talk about ourselves, our experiences, our identities, we're doing so through the lens of our people. And we're not applying a Western-centric lens to understand ourselves, our values, our prioritizations of values, our experiences, etc. So now let's dive into pre-colonial Hebrew civilization. Civilization, I think, is the right word. I think that, as I said before, where these concepts of race, nationalism, religion, ethnicity, culture, these are social constructs that came into the world later on. But what we really were before that was a civilization, like a holistic civilization that had a national component, had a spiritual component, a ritual component, a legal component, and a territorial component. And we were much more than simply the sum of those parts. We weren't just a combination of those things. Hebrew identity is holistic. And And it's important also to keep in mind that the sense of identity and the story we tell ourselves and our children about ourselves is important from a sociological perspective, meaning some aspects of this story, when we, like, for example, when we're at the Seder table and we tell the story of how we were slaves in Egypt and there were 10 plagues that decimated Egyptian civilization and we came out to freedom and the sea parted and we went through and it drowned our enemies. Now, everybody can choose for themselves whether they want to believe in the this story is historically factual or not. Some aspects of our national story have been corroborated by Western scientific methods, and some aspects haven't. But such corroboration doesn't really impact the sociological reality of how we relate to ourselves. Whether certain, essentially understanding our own mythology. And I think our mythology is important, even if somebody wants to argue that the stories themselves aren't factually true. What's still important is where the role these stories play in our understanding of ourselves, our understanding of the world, our values, our sense of mission, etc. So now we have to also acknowledge that there is a historical uniqueness. There's a historical uniqueness that the children of Israel carry with us, and we see it throughout history. I think that's part of our problem today, this historical uniqueness that we'll get to later. But we're a tribal family that really became a nation on foreign soil. We maintained, the story we tell ourselves is that when we were in Egypt, we really maintained our own names, our own dress, our own language, with the exception of one person, by the way. The one person we know of, the one Hebrew we know of, who in Egypt and forevermore became known by an Egyptian name is Moshe. Like, the name Moshe was actually not Moshe's Hebrew name. It was his Egyptian name. And for some reason, we continue to call him Moshe. But aside from Moshe, we maintained our Hebrew names, our Hebrew dress, our Hebrew language. And we have this story we tell ourselves about a supernatural national birth, that we were born miraculously. We were born through this experience of plague decimating the mightiest empire civilization of the time. And when we went out of Egypt, we went out with gold. And this is really important, that we went out with gold, because some of that gold was used to construct the Mishkan, which was our spiritual center. And it's obviously positive. And some of that gold went to construct the golden calf, which we obviously see as negative. So I think this gold we left Egypt with is a good metaphor for understanding our relationship to foreign cultures, or some of the cultural baggage we pick up, even in the diaspora. Both Rudy and I were born outside of our own land. We came here from somewhere. I'm sure a lot of people involved with our movement came from somewhere else to Israel. Some of you haven't come yet and are still living on foreign soil. And when we come back to our land, we come back with gold. I mean, that's part of what we do. As an Amskula, we pick up gold, we pick up values, we pick up cultures, we pick up ideas, we pick up inventions from other civilizations throughout history. But we have to sift, meaning we have to know for ourselves what gold is for the Mishkan and what gold is for the golden calf. And essentially, the sifting mechanism, the tool we're going to need to use for filtering what we learn from other nations and other peoples and other communities and value systems in the world, the filtration method has to be our worldview. So it's really important to understand what is the worldview of the ancient Hebrews. So also we had a collective prophetic experience. Like, that is part of our national story, that we came to Har Sinai, that we, even before that, on the 7th day of Pesach, when the sea split and then, unsplit on our enemies, the entire nation, it says, even the Shivcha, even like the slave girl with us, experienced a level of prophecy beyond what some of our greatest prophets experienced. And that's important. Part of our story is that we have this collective experience of prophecy, and that we're all the reincarnations of those Hebrews who were there for that prophetic moment. So we all had that experience of prophecy. It's etched into our national soul, and then we, engaged in a war to liberate our homeland. And Rudy, you have anything to say there?
Yeah, I mean, this is a way of looking at our culture that is very authentic to us. And I think a beautiful thing that you brought up is taking a story of the Mishkan and the Golden Calf and applying it to Jews coming back home. And that comes with all the riches, not only physical riches, but also the things that the ideas that we come with. Even one could say, wow, we brought in democracy. Well, then now there's a conversation. Is democracy better than a monarchy? Is it? Maybe yes. Or is there something that we need to create that sort of fuses that? So there needs to be a conversation that when we brought the things back, is this something that we want to keep? If we want to keep it, how do we want to keep it? And there are also elements of our culture that was unique to us that was lost. Something that I'm wearing right now on my head, for those of you who don't know, it's called the Sudra. And in the Talmud, in our history, it's the Jewish head covering that we had. Now, in our experience in the diaspora, we lost the Sudra. The way I came back to it is I saw pictures of my great-great-grandfather in Morocco wearing a head turban. And the first thing that came to my mind is, oh, this is what the Arabs wear. But now I realize that that's because my mind was, in a way, colonized. That's what I was conditioned to think and to perceive. However, this is the native head covering. A kippah is never mentioned in the Torah. And the way that a kippah developed is because while we were in the diaspora, Jews that were living in, let's say, Eastern Europe had to minimize their sudra into something that could hide under a hat in order for people not to notice that they were Jews. And Jews living in North Africa or in the Middle East were forced to remove their sudras because they were treated as dhimmis, which is a secondary status in Arab Muslim civilization, where we couldn't do a lot of the things that we wanted to do because it was a symbol of honor. And so now we have to have a conversation as to what is that decolonization process, which is the next part that we're going to go into. But right now we'll continue to focus on the historical uniqueness.
So here you have this idea of being a mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh. And this is something that was said to us even before we received the Ten Commandments, that our mission, our ethos, like what we're in the world for, is to be this mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh. We're supposed to establish a nation. We're supposed to create this civilization in a specific homeland that really expresses the divine ideal in every sphere of human behavior. And of course, the nation is the minimum unit that could do that. Like a group of holy individuals are not able to express the divine ideal in a healthcare system, in a sanitation system, in a military, in an economy, in the marketplace. A nation can do all that. And we're supposed to show the world that all of life, national life, commerce, marital relations, international relations, like all of that can be uplifted to a level of kedusha, a level of holiness, and that the divine ideal can be expressed through that. And that was very much like a central ethos of Hebrew civilization. The way our economy was structured, it was a very interesting, actually. It was an agricultural economy with Shemitah and Yovel. So we had the system where almost every tribe of Israel, not my ancestors and not Rudy's ancestors, because we're both actually from the tribe of Levi. I'm a Kohen, he's a Levi. That means we descend from a tribe that received no agricultural lands. But all the other Hebrew tribes essentially received the same portion. I mean, there's an argument whether or not every tribe got an equal portion or every family got an equal portion. But the idea is that we essentially all start out from the time we come into our land. Yehoshua, who led us in battle against the Canaanite city-states, he divides up the land of Israel between the different tribes and different families. And we all start out with the same. We all start out with the same, access to wealth and resources and agricultural lands. And then you have this like 6-year period of what we could essentially call a free market, where anything can really happen. But then in the 7th year, there are certain resets. Debts are wiped out, right? And et cetera. And so it's like it feels to me like the system we had, and of course, for such a system to be applied today, you would have to be reformed just to meet the technological and realities and economic realities of today. But it seems to be a system that allows for all of the things that the ostensibly warring camps who argue about different economic systems care about. Right? Meaning it seems to be a system that actually expresses what's good and true and important in all of the different, economic philosophies. And we had paradoxically, Hebrew logic is a paradoxical logic, meaning it's not dualistic the way that, Greek logic or Aristotelian logic is dualistic. In paradoxical logic, you can have ostensible opposites occupying the same truth. So we were, on the one hand, a loose tribal confederation, and at the same time, we were a unified kingdom that coexisted. Our language was Hebrew with different tribal subdialects. We know, for example, that the tribe of Menashe had trouble with the shin, which is interesting because the tribe of Menashe, and instead of saying shibolet, they'd say sibolet, right? They would say it like a sin. And another very important feature of our civilization is this idea of the moral and spiritual well-being of the collective being at the center. Now, this is radically different from Western civilization today. I think Western civilization today really puts the material well-being of the individual at the center, like the wants and needs of the individual are really what's most important. That seems to be like the highest value in Western civilization today. But in Hebrew civilization, it was the moral well-being of the collective. And we had this idea that we share a soul. Like I spoke earlier about this national soul that had this prophetic experience, like stamped on it, etched into it. And that's how we self-identified. We self-identified as this, spiritual organism that shines into this world through millions of bodies in space and time called Jews. And that we're all kind of branches of the same spiritual tree, so to speak, that all of Israel is this one soul that moves through history, not only through the Jewish people, but also through the land of Israel, also through the Torah. They're all expressions of the same spiritual organism that we share. And that created a certain kind of relationship with our homeland that's very different from the way people think about territory today. Even the conversations we hear about Israel giving up territory and, in this agreement or that agreement, whether it's the Oslo Accords or the Trump plan, which also demands that Israel give up some territory, that would make sense if we related to territory, if we related to our homeland as a piece of real estate. A piece of real estate, you can buy it, you can sell it, you can trade it, because it's a commodity. But we relate to our homeland as our soulmate, as something that we share a soul with. And we have a very specific relationship with our homeland that we don't have with other countries. For example, we have to take a certain percentage of fruits that are, grown here, produce grown here. We can't we can't eat the fruit of trees for the first couple of years of the tree's existence. We have to let in the 7th year, along with the socioeconomic ramifications of Shemitah, we also have the agricultural ramifications. We let the land lie fallow. Like all of these things are unique practices that our people historically had in relation to our homeland. And we had a specific relationship with nature, which is very different. I think Western civilization has a relationship with nature, that nature is something to conquer. Nature is something to beat into submission and to use for our wants and needs, the wants and needs of the individual. Whereas Israel did not have that view when it came to the natural world. We very much experienced the natural world, especially the country we lived in as our soulmate. Also, we have very clear concepts of spiritual and ritual purity. A lot of our, whether it's going to the mikveh, a mikveh bath, whether it's washing our hands when we wake up in the morning to wash the tumah, the death off of our hands, or before we eat bread, even, the way the Kohanim functioned in the temple. Like, there is this idea of spiritual and ritual purity, which is very important and very central to our society. And we also have...
Let me touch on this one.
Sure.
Even when it comes to the concept of what we consider Hashem or God or a higher power, going to a Jewish modern Orthodox day school my entire life, I was always taught that Judaism is a monotheism. We believe in one God. So yes, we believe in one God, but not in the sense of what monotheism means. There's a story in the Torah about Abraham and how he was able to have the realizations of who we are, what we are. And basically his father sold idols, and he was left in charge of the idol shop one day, and he smashed all of the idols and left only one very large one standing. And when his father came back, he asked him, what happened? And Abraham then called Abraham, said, this large idol basically smashed all the other idols. And his dad said, that's crazy. That can't happen there. It's just a piece of stone. It's just a piece of wood. And he said, yeah, so why are you praying to it? And the point wasn't to say that there's only one individual God, but that the concept of even praying to one individual thing is idol worship. And what Hashem really is, when we say we believe in one God, is that we believe in oneness, that this world is one, that the entire universe, everything interconnected with nature and humanity and space and science and time, everything connected is one universal concept that is better described with the word panentheism than monotheism, the belief in oneness. And yes, there is individuality within the oneness, just like we are one being, but we have organs. All of our body parts is made up of many organs, many cells, many molecules, energy, and it all makes up one. And me, myself, as one individual, I make up one within a family. And one within a family, we make up one within a tribe. And within that tribe, we're part of a nation, a civilization. And within this civilization, we're part of a greater world and an ecosystem. And this entire idea of oneness to the max is what we believe is Hashem, is God, not this individual force that we look up in the sky. It's something that we must fear, but it's something that we must, be connected to and understand and comprehend that we are part of oneness. And that's what Judaism is. It's panentheism, not monotheism.
Yeah, so panentheism is, for those who don't understand, the idea that there is a timeless ultimate reality without end that creates all, sustains all, empowers all, and loves all, and we are all part of that. It's very, it's not this, one giant God in heaven that's, separate from us, but rather this organic whole that we're all a part of. And our relationship to this panentheist, in Kabbalistic literature, or often called Ein Sof, like just, or Ein Sof, light without end. Our relationship to Hashem, for lack of a better word, or Yud Ke Vav Ke, is multifaceted. And sometimes we relate to Hashem as a father, sometimes as a king, sometimes as the author in the stories we're living in, the stories we're characters in, and sometimes it's a very similar relationship to that of a Jedi and the Force. Something that kind of like empowers us and strengthens us, and that we can experience is kind of empowering everything around us as well, and that everything we experience is an expression of that. That's the idea. Ein od milvado. There's nothing outside of Hashem, and that was the worldview of the Hebrews. And not just the worldview, the experience of the Hebrews, and that's very important. It's one thing to intellectually understand these concepts, but when we talk about pre-colonial Hebrew civilization, there was a spiritual experience that was taking place. Just to give you an example of how this worked, there's an idea. We say that every blade of grass has a malach telling it to grow. Malach is often translated into English as angel, but I think we have to be careful with a lot of the English translations we use. So sometimes we're going to use Hebrew terms tonight and offer the translation, but at the same time, at the same time, also clarify why that translation may or may not be the best term to describe it. So this idea that every blade of grass has a malach telling it to grow means essentially that everything in the world, down to the individual blade of grass, actually has a spiritual back end, right? Like just like, I as an individual might have a soul, even though that soul might actually be part of a collective soul that we call Israel, and there are layers, because there's also this collective soul that includes all of creation, etc. But down to the blade of grass, down to the laptop I'm using, down to the cell phone I used, and the dinner I had earlier, like all of that has a spiritual back end, and we used to experience the world that way. And what that led to in Hebrew society, which is really interesting, those of us who were strong, those of us who were disciplined, those of us who were able to really work on ourselves became prophets, and prophecy was rampant, like what we call nivuah. And then there's levels of prophecy. The Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, in the Guide to the Perplexed, actually talks about 11 different levels of nivuah. And then there's Moshe, which is like beyond the 11. So not everybody's nivuah, not everybody's prophecy was the same, but prophecy was a Hebrew national trait. So those of us who were really able to work on ourselves and be strong and disciplined were prophets. But those of us who weren't still needed that spiritual connection. And the way that would often express itself was through idol worship, meaning we weren't primitive. I think like part of the problem is, and this is a very Western way of looking at the world, is that we are advanced today and our ancestors were primitive and stupid and believed in silly things. But there's a real experience that our ancestors have that actually pulled them towards, sacrificing an animal to a tree or to a statue. There was some quick spiritual fix that they needed, similar to maybe in contemporary society, how we'd understand a drug addict just needing like a quick fix to feel okay. So too, like spiritually, when you're aware of the spiritual reality around you, we lived in a society where we were experiencing these things. When we brought korbanot, which is often translated as sacrifices, but that's also a problematic translation. When we brought korbanot in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple, we, at this time, we're talking about the first temple period, we would experience the fire coming down from the sky and consuming it, right? And that's an experience that existed in the world. And I don't think it was just us. If you look at this time period, at different civilizations around this time period, everybody had this kind of mythology. Everybody seemed to be experiencing this spiritual energy, but defining it differently. And as we move on, we'll talk about how different civilizations later related to the loss of this spiritual experience. But I think it was a very real experience that humanity had at one point in history, and the way we understood it is unique to us, whereas other civilizations understood it different. But before we move on to the next slide, there's also this idea of universal mission, which is really, really important, because that was something that really united the people of Israel. And I think the way to understand our universal mission is that we as a collective, as the children of Israel, are meant to participate with the Creator in perfecting creation. And the formula for achieving it is really through the children of Israel establishing a unique civilization in the land of Israel that manifests the divine ideal in every sphere of human behavior and national life. And it's through the story of the Jewish people, through the story of the children of Israel, with all of its ups and downs, and the example Israel sets of Kedusha, national perfection to the rest of the world, all of humanity will ultimately be brought to the conscious awareness of the oneness of the world, of Hashem's oneness, as well as the realization that all of creation is really one organic whole. And this is it's through this knowledge that the nations of the world ultimately revert back to families. Like, this is also part of our mission, our national mission, to a certain extent, is to get rid of nationalism, to take nations and put them back to families, because you see this process in the beginning of the Torah after the flood of families becoming nations. And then when Hashem speaks to Abraham and tells him he's going to make him a nation, he says that all the families of the world are going to be blessed through you. And all of these and the difference really is that, nations have hard borders between them. Distrust, animosity, the natural state between nations is war. But families can interact, families can relate to one another in a much more harmonious and friendly way. And of course, each family can have its own unique society, its own unique culture, and humanity will essentially become a global tapestry of distinct identities and cultures that are all unified in knowledge of Hashem and what we call the Noahide laws. So, which are 7 basic laws that each civilization is really supposed to adhere to and build their own unique culture on top of. So that was kind of the mission that Israel believed. We weren't just coming into our land to create a society that would serve us. The idea was that we were meant to interact with the rest of humanity in such a way that changes the world. We impact the world. We act on the world, and we're not meant to be an isolationist nation, but rather a nation that engages the world and brings the world somewhere that's radically different from where they were before. So then we have these systems of government, right? Like the way our society was structured. We had the Melech, we had the Shofet, we had the Kohen, and we had the Navi. Those were essentially the main leaders that kind of checked and balanced each other. We could translate these words. The Melech often is translated into English as king, but I think that king is a problematic word when talking about Melech, because when people think of a king, they usually think of like an autocratic ruler. And that's not what the Melech was. The Melech was kind of the nation in concentrate. Like it was like the whole national soul that was concentrated in one person who is the leader that we look up to and are excited to follow. I think the best way to really understand the relationship between the nation and the Melech would be to look at how the Chabad movement relates to their Rebbe. I think that's one of the most important things that we can learn from the Chabad movement. The way they look at their Rebbe is really the way I want to look at my national leader. Like I would love to have somebody to vote for who the way the average Chabadnik relates to the Rebbe. Like to really just see myself as I'm on his mission, I'm an extension of him, happy to do it, and feeling really, really fulfilled in life, having a great time on that mission with him. So that's the Melech. And the Melech's main responsibilities are to lead us when it comes to war. The Melech, by the way, unlike many national leaders in many cultures, the Melech goes in the front. Like the Melech leads us in battle. He doesn't stay behind. He doesn't send us into battle. He leads us into battle, which is something, the ideal leader from our history was David. And usually David would lead us into battle. But it should be noted that the episode, without getting into the details of the episode, but the famous episode of David and Bathsheba, which David is often criticized for, it starts with the pasuk that he stayed behind while Israel was at war with Ammon. So there's already a criticism of a national leader, even though he fought many wars before then and after then, and he was always in the front. This one time he wasn't in the front of the army, that he didn't lead us into battle. It wasn't so good for him, and it wasn't so good for us. So that's the Melech. Then you have the Shofet, who's essentially the judge. We can say in modern terms, we can say like the Supreme Court. He's like back then, by the way, it's not like a modern rabbi who just kind of makes jokes about your favorite baseball team under the chuppah at a wedding. Back then, to have smicha, to be a rabbi, what back then was to have the ability to sentence people to death, and maybe even to revive the dead. That's what we say. We say that there's nobody we would call rabbi back then who didn't have the power to actually revive the dead. Not that people did that all the time, but that was what it meant to back then to be a rabbi. That we don't have anymore. Like when we call people today, in Israel we don't call people rabbi. Actually, we say rav, because rav means like a teacher, but not somebody with smicha. Real smicha, which was passed down from Moshe to Yoshua and to the elders, etc. Was later, that's part of our colonization, that was discontinued during the Roman period. Then there's the Kohen. I'm a Kohen, but when we say Kohen, we're talking about the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. The Kohen, he really, I think obviously the Kohanim run the temple and the Leviim assist, but the Kohen's job is to inspire the nation, to really create the conditions, whether we're talking about the smells, we're talking about the sounds, we're talking about the costumes, we're talking just to put on a good show, a show that really maximizes the spiritual experience that the nation is having. And then you have the Navi, the leading prophet of a generation who can kind of kick the whole thing over. He's like the wild card. And he can come and kind of dictate to the Melech what needs to happen and kind of overturn the whole thing. And of course, we did actually have, Rudy mentioned democracy before. There was a system of democracy that we had in ancient Israel, which was a participatory democracy where you had captains of 10 and captains of hundreds and captains of thousands, like sending representatives, kind of on a regular basis to represent their interests, in what we had, the Knesset, the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. So you have some major events at this time, like just going through it quickly. We have the era of the judges, followed by a unified kingdom. Then early on in the unified kingdom, you have the temple constructed by Shlomo, the son of David. Then the kingdom splits after the death of Shlomo into the kingdom of Israel, which is the majority of tribes, and the kingdom of Yehuda. So you have Israel and Judea. Israel was actually the more powerful kingdom for a long time, economically, militarily, diplomatically, more important on the world stage. Although when we talk about them today, we tend to think more about the Judean kingdom because we're the descendants of the Judean kingdom, and they were in Jerusalem, and that was the Davidic dynasty. So they're more important to our history. But if we were living at that time, the Israelite kingdom, the Israeli kingdom would have seemed much more important. And the Israeli kingdom was exiled, and eventually, a few generations later, the Judean kingdom was exiled and the temple was destroyed. Then there was a partial return, 70 years later, construction of a new temple. And eventually there was a Maccabean revolt and renewed independence, Hasmonean kingdom, where our tribe, the Kohanim, the descendants, the children of the Maccabean, took power, which is not supposed to happen. I am not supposed to be a melech. I'm a kohen. Rudy is not supposed to be a melech. He's a Levi. Like, we have our unique roles, our functions in Hebrew society, and we're not supposed to try to be things that we're not. And then there was Roman conquest and the destruction of Jerusalem. And those are really the major events that are characterizing ancient Israeli society. And that really brings us to really trying to understand the processes and layers of Jewish colonization that took place. So we're going to dive in. First, you have I think the first real colonial act that happened to us was the Assyrian exile of the Israeli kingdom. The majority of the tribes were uprooted and displaced. We were not prepared for exile, which is really important, and that will influence a lot of the behaviors of our national leaders later on. The Israeli kingdom was not prepared for exile, and to a certain extent, it looks as if we've lost them. There are certain groups that have come back to Israel and have identified themselves to be some of these lost tribes. We hope that more will come back, that will reunite with all of our brothers and sisters who are exiled, but at this moment, we don't know who they all are. And there's lots of theories floating around that maybe this group or maybe that group, could really be one of the lost tribes of Israel. But they weren't prepared for exile in the way that we would later be prepared for exile. And
in Africa, there are actually some tribes where they've located a Kohen gene. Mm-hmm. And there are many Jews in Africa that, they don't call themselves Jews, they call themselves Israelites. Even the Israelites that live in Ethiopia, what we call Ethiopian here in Israel, they never even identified as Jews. They identified as Israelites. And when Jews came to freedom, it was actually the first time that they even heard this word Jew, because they had descended from the Israelites as other Africans or Jews, Israelites living in Africa, and also the Bnei Menashe, a community of Jews living in northeast India that recently started to make aliyah and to come back home and to revive their civilization, which they believe to have come from the tribe of Menashe. So it's a part of a decolonization process where we need to find the tribes that have been lost, but we also know that a lot of them have been lost and we cannot find them.
Yeah, and we hope to eventually, meaning just like we found the tribe of Menashe, or hopes that it's the tribe. A lot of them are actually my neighbors. A lot live around here. A lot lived in Gaza before Ariel Sharon kicked them out. A lot lived near Hebron. Yeah, so and a lot were in the army with me. They're like good soldiers, and they're strong and resilient. And hope they're the tribe of Menashe, and we hope more tribes show up. So then you have the next real colonial act was the first destruction of Jerusalem, right? The Babylonian Empire. Babylon dominates Judea. By the way, we are called Jews today. Even though I'm a Kohen and Rudy is a Levi, neither one of us is from the tribe of Yehuda. Neither one of us are really Jews technically. We're both Hebrews. We're both Israelites. But we're not really Jews technically. We're not from the tribe of Judah. But we're called Jews today because we're from the Judean kingdom. Like we are the descendants of Malchut Yehuda, the Judean kingdom that was located in Judea, which is for the most part at about half the West Bank. Like I live in northern Judea. I live on a mountain near Beit El, very close to Ramallah, about 20 minutes north of Jerusalem. So that's like northern Judea. But we're called Jews because we're from the kingdom of Judea, from the area of Judea, even though Rudy and I are not actually Jews technically because we're not from the tribe of Judah. But our tribe, the tribe of Levi, along with the tribes of Benjamin and Shimon, stuck with the kingdom of Judah and did not become part of the kingdom of Israel. Different tribes had different reasons for that. The reason that our tribe stuck with the kingdom of Judah and did not become part of Israel is because we had no agricultural lands. As I said before, our tribe had no agricultural lands, and we lost our job security in the kingdom of Israel because the first king of Israel after the split, Yerovam ben Nevat, basically said, just like he became the king, even though he wasn't from the tribe of Judah and was not a descendant of David, he said anybody can be a Kohen, you don't have to be from the tribe of Levi. So we lost our job security, we had no agricultural lands, and we all basically migrated down to the kingdom of Yehuda, where we became Jews, essentially. So Babylon dominates Judea. There's a failed Judean revolt where we tried to free ourselves. It didn't work out. In fact, it's a very interesting, isolated incident where a prophet tells a Hebrew king not to revolt, not to fight back against the Babylonian conquest. That was essentially a divine message at the time. The temple was destroyed. And when the temple is destroyed, there's an experience that takes place. And this is really important. What we call in Hebrew the histalkut hashchina, the withdrawal of the divine presence. We said earlier that during the first temple period, there was a spiritual experience that wasn't only experienced by our people, but really by other peoples as well. Like, for example, let's just take the Greeks. This is the time period where the Greeks believed the gods walked the earth, that there was Zeus and there was Hermes and Hercules and Aphrodite. This is the time period. And they believed in this. And there was a spiritual experience that all of the world was having, and different societies at the time had different explanations for it. And pretty much, coincidentally or not coincidentally, this spiritual energy, this spiritual experience that humanity was having ended when the first temple was destroyed. And different civilizations reacted differently to this event. And this is really important because the Greek reaction to this event, meaning the reaction of the philosophers, the Greek philosophers to this new reality, was to say, our grandparents were foolish. They believed in something stupid. We don't have that experience. Obviously, that experience wasn't real, but our ancestors were just primitive fools. And so we're going to recreate reality according to our rational intellect. And that was the Greek reaction to the histalkut hashchina. And that, I think, is Western civilization's reaction to it now. When you have these conversations in Western civilization, there is this attitude that people used to be primitive, people used to believe in stupid things, and now we are intelligent. Now we we've gained wisdom, we gain understanding, and we're not so foolish as we were once upon a time. That is a Greek way of looking at this, whereas the Hebrew approach to the Histalkut HaShekhinah is to say our ancestors had an experience. We don't have that experience. We don't see the fire coming down from heaven and consuming offerings on the altar. We don't have prophecy, running through the nation. We don't feel a drive to sacrifice an animal to a tree. Like, we don't feel that spiritual energy, but our ancestors did. We believe they really did. That's part of our story. And we even have this idea that humanity is going to have that again. And that this process that, for example, next week we're celebrating Yom Ha'atzmaut, the Jewish people coming back to life after 2,000 years. There is an idea among many people in Israeli society that Yom Ha'atzmaut is the beginning of a historical chapter that is going to return the world to that state of spiritual experience. That the world is going to have, not just us, everyone is going to have that again, because the world may just be beyond what our limited senses can pick up right now. So just to be very clear, the adoption, everybody can choose to believe what he or she wants, but the adoption of the Greek understanding of this event and this shift is part of our colonization. Like, there is an authentic Hebrew way of understanding this event, what happened and what it means, that's different from the Greek understanding. Most of the world today, especially the Western world, has adopted the Greek understanding, and we should at least be able to make an educated choice what we are going to choose to believe. Now, after this event, the majority of Judeans are exiled to Babylon. Babylon is eclipsed by the Persian Empire. There's a partial return after 70 years. The Purim story takes place around this time. And under Persian rule, the returnees, roughly 40,000 Jews, we're all called Jews at this point, whether you're from the tribe of Benjamin or Levi or Shimon, we're called Jews. Roughly 40,000 or so Jews come back and rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the temple under Persian rule. And when we rebuild the temple, we're still conducting, the korbanot, and we have the Kohanim and the Levi'im working in the temple, but we no longer have the fire descending from the sky and consuming the offerings. It's a different spiritual reality. It's a different experience than it was first time around. Then you have the Syrian Greek domination. Alexander the Great, Greece eclipses Persia as a dominant power in the world. It then splits into 3 separate empires. The Syrian Greeks ultimately ruled Judea. You have to remember that what was important about Judea, the reason why all these different empires, whether it's Babylon or Persia or Greece or later Rome, were so interested in our country, like, what natural resource did we have? It's not, no oil, diamonds, but we had apparently glass, like we apparently invented glass blowing, but more important, geography. Like, Israel was important because of the geography. Anybody who wanted to be a world power, I don't know how many of you have ever played the game Risk, but if you play the game Risk, you see that our country kind of, is the border between Asia and Africa. And that was a very important, whether as a buffer or as a launching pad, to invade some other territory, our country was a very important country to rule if you wanted to be a world power on the international stage. So when the Syrian Greeks ruled Judea, Antiochus IV basically initiates a very aggressive policy of Hellenization, that he wants to homogenize his empire. He wants everybody to subscribe to a very specific worldview, a very specific value system, very specific activities, sports, etc. At this point, by the way, the Greeks no longer believe in Mount Olympus and all those gods, but they do believe it's an important tool to unify their empire. Like, you're supposed to pay lip service to it. Even though you don't really believe in it, it's part of the culture and you kind of do it at this point. Now, part of this included a ban on very central features of Judean culture. Antiochus outlaws our calendar, the lunar calendar. Tonight is Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of the month of Iyar. And we weren't allowed to celebrate Rosh Chodesh on penalty of death. We weren't allowed to circumcise our sons penalty of death. In fact, many Jews who wanted to be Greek or wanted to be accepted by the Greeks underwent very painful medical procedures to reverse their circumcisions. Shabbat was outlawed. Learning of Torah was outlawed. All of these things were outlawed under penalty of death. And the temple service was outlawed. And there was, of course, also a domination of our markets, which is part of Hellenization, and forced idolatry. They wanted to see us, at least, paying the same respect to the Greek gods that they did, even though they no longer really believed in it. They wanted us to kind of go along with their like game as well. There were prima nocta laws. I don't know if people understand what that was, but basically when I don't know who's seen the movie Braveheart, because you have something similar there, but essentially when a Jewish couple would get married, the local Greek official would have first rights to the bride before her husband that night. Like he would be able to bed the kala, bed the bride before she would be available to her husband after the wedding. And of course, there was a desecration of the Jerusalem temple under Antiochus. But then you have, of course, the Maccabean Revolt, which was a 26-year guerrilla struggle for freedom. It established an independent kingdom, like we said before, but there were no serious decolonization efforts. So here you have an example in our history of us taking control of our own country through a very bloody and brutal guerrilla war that lasted essentially a generation. And we take power, and our country is free, but we don't address we don't decolonize. We essentially don't go through, especially ideologically, we don't go through this experience, this conversation of really trying to figure out how are we influenced by the Greeks? How are we influenced by our exile in Babylon? And here we are, returned to independence with our own kingdom, and a very powerful kingdom for a while. The Hasmonean kingdom was strong. But this Hellenistic influence really remained within our people, really took root, and really influenced Hebrew civilization until you had a rivalry for the throne between two Hasmonean brothers that opened the door for Rome, specifically the general Pompey, to come in and dominate. So then you have the Roman conquest, and the Romans very quickly got rid of the Hasmonean dynasty, and they installed the puppet Herodian dynasty. There are a series of failed Judean revolts against the Romans, although it cost the Romans a great deal, meaning it wasn't easy for them to put down these revolts, but they ultimately did. And this led to the temple being destroyed, the second temple being destroyed. Now, at this point, remember I said before that the Israeli kingdom wasn't ready for exile, and that's why they essentially vanished, at least temporarily. The rabbis, after the Jerusalem temple is destroyed, they make our civilization portable. They go through this process in Yavne of making our civilization portable. So if we go into exile, we can survive outside of our own natural habitat. Now, there are more failed revolts after this. Many fighters are sold into slavery. There are Roman laws to completely erase Judean culture, Judean identity. We weren't allowed to live anywhere from where we could even see the ruins of Jerusalem, because the emperor understood that any Jew who could remember Jerusalem, right? We say, if I forget Jerusalem, I should forget my right hand. So he said no Jew should be able to live anywhere from where they could see Jerusalem, because we do not want the Jews to fight. We do not want the Jews to revolt anymore. And there was this effort to erase our identity. And it's interesting that at the time, the rabbis also essentially said, we have to suppress the militancy within the Jewish people. These revolts are going to lead to our destruction. We keep losing. And, a lot of the ideas, there are seeds planted at that time because of the necessity of that specific situation that really led to aspects of our identity being changed. When you hear this idea of Jews not being able to fight, especially in the diaspora, not being able to defend themselves, not being able to have an army, this really comes from seeds the rabbis planted at that time, because they wanted us to stop fighting. They wanted us to stop revolting. They wanted to suppress our militancy. And this oppression that the Romans, very severe, very harsh oppression that the Romans enact on us, ultimately leads to mass dispossession. And, a lot of us, like I said, the freedom fighters were sold as slaves to Rome. That's really where the Ashkenazi and Sephardi communities come from. I apologize to all our Mizrahi listeners if we're not going to be following your story. We're really following the story of the 40,000 or so Jews that came back to Judea after the Babylonian exile. So, a lot of those people, a lot of those Jews were exiled to Europe, specifically Rome, as gladiators and as prostitutes and as slaves after the Bar Kokhba revolt. And these exiled Jews who migrated.
Just to add a point there, the empire and this image that you have here is really from the Arch of Titus. If anyone has taken a trip to Italy, to Rome, and was able to see the Colosseum, of course, is a monument that you grow up seeing. I want to one day travel to this place, and I've seen a lot of my Jewish friends go there and post pictures on Instagram or on Facebook and take a selfie and smile. But to me, this is a place that was built off of the looting and the destruction of Jerusalem. The money that was taken from destroying our civilization was then used to build the Colosseum, in which the Arch of Titus, which is basically a trophy right outside of the Colosseum that has this image in it, is showing that we're so proud of this event that we destroyed Judea, we destroyed the Judean civilization, we used their gold and their riches to build this Colosseum, a Colosseum which, by the way, took Jewish warriors and turned them into gladiators to kill each other for Roman entertainment. So anyone here who is Jewish, I'm sure there might be some non-Jews as well listening to this conversation, but anyone who's Jewish, and if you ever get to go to Rome, of course not right now with Corona, but after, and go to the Colosseum and take a picture, or even just be there, understand the meaning of the place that you are, that the destruction of our civilization and the death and the murders and the enslavement and the colonization, both mental and physical, of an entire generation of Jews, and also what happened post-generations. This is the place that took the material wealth that we had and built something with it to represent Roman glory through the death of Jews. So it's something important to understand, and it's a story that really a lot of Jews don't know. A lot of these conversations that we're having right now about what does it mean to be colonized and to decolonize, these are things that we weren't taught, because going to a Jewish day school, at least in my experience, but I think the experience of the vast majority of Jews in the diaspora, we learn about how to be Jews in theory, how to do Birkat HaMazon and Shemona Esrei and putting tefillin and Shabbat and maybe the Passover and cultural things that come with that, but we don't understand really what it meant to be a civilization that existed, what happened to our civilization on a deep level, and what we aspire to do greater than just, okay, next year in Jerusalem. Well, what does that mean? Is it just a concept that is theoretical? Is it something that just is an idea, or is it something that actually happened that we need to aspire to come back to and to unpack those elements in which we created a suitcase to preserve our identity, and to unpack that, and then to remove the elements in which we packed along the way that aren't true to who we are, or to find those elements that aren't true to who we are and infuse them in a way that works for us and that becomes a true way of expression. And that's the conversation that we want to have today, and that we're trying to have through Vision, is to understand that, yes, we don't live like we do back in the day. We are in a modern day, and with modern day, we've learned a lot of new things. That doesn't mean that we didn't have information then, but the world has changed. But now that we're back home, we have to have a conversation about unpacking those elements of colonization.
Right. I want to give one practical example of what Rudy's talking about, because, the Romans made many laws, we said, to erase our identity. One of those was this idea of tzitzit. We used to wear these blue and white strings. I don't know if everybody sees these kind of blue and white strings that we wear often on our undergarments today, like on garments underneath our shirts. But it used to be that we would wear them over our shirts. It used to be we would wear a shirt, an outer garment with four corners, and have those blue and white strings hanging from each corner of the garment. And that was one of the things the Romans outlawed, also penalty of death. So this custom you see today of Jewish men wearing these kind of like undershirts with four corners and these blue and white strings on them is a result of our colonization. And whether when we talk about colonization, it doesn't always mean want to put it back to the way it used to be and walk around with four-cornered garments with blue and white strings, although I personally think that would be cool. And if anybody's interested in doing that, maybe we'll start, creating movement shirts, like shirts like this. I don't mean like a baguette free, but like a shirt like this with four corners that we can we can start rocking publicly with like because no Roman soldier is going to come and kill us for it today. But that's an example of ways in which our culture changed as a result of all this happening. Now, it's really important to stress at this point that a lot of our, what becomes this portable version of our civilization includes a lot of remembrances for our civilization that are no longer accessible to us, as well as like tefillot. I think it's really problematic to refer to tefillah as prayer. The English word we often use for tefillah is prayer, which is a very Christian concept. It comes from the Latin word that means to beg. The Hebrew concept of tefillah is really more about reminding ourselves of our national aspirations and aligning our conscious will with the will of our collective soul. Like that's really what the Amidah is all about, really like plugging into this collective soul and working towards achieving the aspirations of the Jewish people in history. And for the most part, when this exile begins, we regard ourselves, we see ourselves as basically refugees. We see ourselves as Judean refugees, and that is the experience that we're having. That is a self-identity that we're kind of carrying with us at this point. And it's really important to keep that in mind because that will obviously be impacted as we end up in the belly of the beast. So inside Europe now, and again, we're not trying to erase anybody else's experiences, but we're tracing the Judeans who end up in Europe as exiles, some stayed in the land of Israel and some are even today Palestinians, but for the most part, we're following those who were exiled, and they experience what we'll call internal colonization within Europe, which is very rare. Usually the way colonization works is that a colonizing nation goes out to someone else's land, colonizes that people, but you have a situation here where the Jewish people or the Judean refugees are essentially absorbed into the lands that are ruled by their enemies beginning with Rome, because originally we go to Rome, and as Rome's power spreads throughout Europe and Christianity spreads throughout Europe, the Judean refugees spread out throughout Europe as well. And we continue to experience layers and layers and layers of colonization inside the belly of the beast, inside the lands of our enemies. And so we largely, during this time, for the most part, with a few exceptions, we're living in ghetto communities that are separate from the host nations, and we're living according to a portable version of Hebrew civilization. That's the portable version that the rabbis at Yavna created. Now, the national and territorial components of Jewish identity became increasingly theoretical and are ultimately pushed into the background of Jewish life, meaning the spiritual, ritual, legal components of our identity remain intact. The national and territorial components of our identity, they still exist. We still know about them, or most of us know about them, but they're kind of pushed into the background because they're no longer relevant. We're living on foreign soil. We're living in ghettos.
I would say even like today, they're still pushed to the back. A lot of things that we pray towards Jerusalem. We say Shana Yerushalayim, or even something that's referenced a lot, even in pop culture in America, of this smashing of the glass when you get married and yelling Mazal Tov after. You can discuss why those in Jerusalem don't yell Mazal Tov after the smashing of the glass, but most Jews themselves don't even understand what the glass represents. It actually represents the destruction of Jerusalem and our temple, and the promise that the generations to come with the wedding that we have, our descendants will one day come back home and rebuild it. So it's crazy to me that we do this smashing of the glass, but we don't even understand what it means. So it was pushed back so far that only those that really are at the top and know Torah and have been scholars of our history and our story know about it, but the vast majority of the population doesn't even understand that when they get married and they break this glass, that what it represents is a promise and a commitment in a physical act to promise that within the next generations, one day we will come back and rebuild Jerusalem. And
Right.
you can touch, I think, on why in Jerusalem and why many Jews today do not yell Mazal Tov or scream Mazal Tov after the smashing of the glass.
Right. At the weddings that I've been fortunate enough to be able to participate in an official capacity, I think even some of the people joining us today have had me, at their wedding under their chuppah, in which I'm very careful to either move the breaking of the glass, like the Jerusalem custom, so that it's not near the Mazal Tov, so we don't say Mazal Tov with the breaking of the glass, or to at least take the microphone and explain to all the guests why we shouldn't applaud, say Mazal Tov at the breaking of the glass, actually have something in between, like breaking the glass, something, and then you can say Mazal Tov after that. So at this point, our cultural development, it really continues on foreign soil, under conditions of extreme powerlessness, very harsh persecution. There are waves of really, really, really traumatic persecution over many centuries, and this persecution really results in expulsions, massacres, and a heightened sense of vulnerability and helplessness among our people. And this ultimately leads to the redefining of our identity. So, this traumatic persecution that we experienced for centuries develops within the Jewish people a yearning for Gentile acceptance. And that leads, once we have what we call the Age of Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the transition from feudalism to capitalism, you have what's called the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, where we start to redefine our own identity. Essentially, Jews were offered legal inclusion within certain European nations like France and Germany, and we accepted. But part of the price of acceptance was to redefine our identity. And so this portable version of Hebrew civilization that we had carried around with us until now becomes redefined at this point into a religion called Judaism. I would say this is really the birth of what we call Judaism, this redefining of our portable civilization as a religion, like as being in the category of this social construct called religion. We call it Judaism. You won't find that word in the Tanakh. You won't find that word in the Talmud. You won't find that word in the Kabbalistic literature. It's a relatively modern word. And the Jewish self-identification shifts from Judean refugees to Europeans of a Jewish faith, whether it's Germans of the Mosaic persuasion, Frenchmen of the Jewish religion, whatever you want to say, our identity changes. We no longer, for the most part, in certain places in Europe and very dominant Jews, in terms of the different levels of influence Jews have in different parts of the world, a lot of very important Jewish leaders begin to redefine Jewish identity from Judean refugees wanting to go home, which is what we essentially were for 1,700 years, to Europeans of a Jewish faith. And even today, a lot of our listeners probably grew up in the United States, in Canada, in England, in different parts of the world, thinking of themselves as American with a religion called Judaism, as opposed to being
this division that exists within Judaism of orthodoxy, conservative, and reform. This comes from the church. If you look at the Sephardic communities and the Mizrahi communities, they never had this concept. You were a Jew, you are a Jew, you're a Jew, regardless as to your level of observance and your path and what you connect to and what, that's another question. But this division of the way you practice and creating these sort of groups based on what the Christian church had of orthodoxy, conservative, and reform is a concept that was superimposed onto the way that we express ourselves during this time as well, of redefining who we are in order for it to be more appropriate to a Western world, in order for them to accept us. Rather than find a way for us to be true to who we are and to live amongst others, we try to change us from within in order to be accepted. But as we see, that never actually worked.
Right. So, they have Methodists and Protestants and Catholics and, Episcopalians. And so we said, hey, why don't we have Orthodox and Reform, etc. And that's essentially how these denominations
have Orthodox and Reform also.
I'm sorry?
They also have Orthodox and Reform and Conservative.
Right. So we were essentially influenced. Once we saw ourselves as a religion, we could have denominations. So these are I just want to summarize here before we move on to the ways you can get involved in Vision, because before we talk about our decolonization experiences, which I think are as important as the colonization we suffered, I just want to kind of summarize the episodes of colonization we experienced. We have the destruction and exile of the Israeli kingdom, the destruction of Jerusalem, the Hiskut Shechina, the exile of the Judean kingdom, the forced Hellenization under Antiochus IV, the Roman conquest, the destruction of Jerusalem, laws to erase Judean identity, exile, persecution leading to a desire for assimilation, and then adopting Judaism as a religious identity. These are layers and layers and layers of colonization that we suffered, and our decolonization is going to have to deal with all of that. But right now, I really want to tell listeners how you can get involved with the Vision movement, right? To help us spread these ideas in the Jewish world. We have lots of opportunities for you to support us. We want you to support us. We want you to get involved with us. One of the ways you can get involved is through financial support, because like any organization, any movement, we definitely can use your help on the financial front. And here is what, I can turn off my face for this just so you can get a clearer picture of what you're going to see. If you are willing to donate to the movement, $18 a month, you will be able to receive a PDF copy of the slides from this webinar. We will show you soon, by the way, how you can donate, don't worry. But if you're willing to donate $18 a month to the movement, you will receive a PDF copy of the slides from this webinar, so you can go and show your friends how we were colonized and how we're going to decolonize. Now, if you're willing to give us $36 a month, you'll get a Vision Movement sweatshirt limited to the first 36 people that make this donation. You'll get this sweatshirt mailed to you. This is a sweatshirt that looks really good on Rudy. It looks really good on me. It'll look really good on you. Purple and black just looks really cool. That's, by the way, on the sweatshirt, you have the Bar Kokhba coin. In ancient times when we would fight for our freedom from foreign rule, we would mint coins as a declaration of independence. And that's how we would tell the world that we're free, through our coinage. Remember, back then, all of the currencies in the world were basically the same weights of the same metals. So you could essentially pay for an item in the marketplace with 20 different currencies, because they're all really the weight of the weight of a certain metal with a different national symbol or writing or emperor's picture on it. So often what we would do when we would fight for our freedom, the way we would declare our independence from foreign rule was to mint coins. And this particular coin was minted by Shimon Bar Kokhba and the Rabbi Akiva when they fought to free our country from Roman rule. In the year 132, they did achieve independence for a few years, and then in the year 135, the revolt was crushed. Underneath, if you look at that, those four symbols there, that's actually ancient Hebrew. That's Paleo Hebrew. That actually says Chazon, which means vision. It's a Vision Movement sweatshirt that you will get with a monthly donation of $36. If you're willing to give us $72 a month, and this is really important, the First Tithe by Dr. Israel Eldad is, in my opinion, one of the most important books that you can read if you're interested in Jewish liberation. These are the memoirs of the leader of the Jewish underground during the anti-colonial struggle to free our country from British rule. Eldad, I can't even describe, I can't do justice to the worldview that Eldad presents us with, but really it's such a deep and such a deeply Jewish, and this is not somebody who was Shomer Mitzvot. We're not talking about somebody who is what we would call an observant Jew, but we're talking about somebody who is very, very, very deeply connected to an authentic Hebrew worldview. And you can see it through his writing, you can see it through his ideas, and I think that this is a very important book for understanding the forces that cyclically come into our world in each chapter of our story. The First Tithe happens to be the story of how the Lechi, the fighters for the freedom of Israel, the Lochamei Cherut Israel, fought to free our land from British rule in the 1940s, written by the ideological leader of Lechi, Israel Eldad. But it's really a book that's applicable and relevant to every chapter of Jewish history, including our own. So with a monthly donation of $72, you will get a copy of the First Tithe, an English translation. Second edition, by the way, which is more accurate in terms of the translation than the first edition, a second edition English translation of the First Tithe by Dr. Eldad. Now, if you are willing to give us $180 a month, you will be invited to participate in a weekly online class with me, where we're actually going to be talking about some of the figures, some of the ideas, some of the liberation movements that over the centuries between Bar Kokhba and Herzl attempted to liberate the Jewish people and understand a lot of the ideas and characters and events that took place. This is a big black hole in Jewish history. Most of us don't learn this, not in Hebrew school, not in day school, not usually not at the university level, not in yeshivot. And this is an important part of our history. So I really think it's a valuable opportunity. I'm willing to give of my time on a weekly basis to teach this class, and some of you are already participating. I invite more to get involved and be part of this class. Now, with a monthly donation of $360, you will get a private tour of wineries in northern Judea and southern Samaria, best wine in the country from the tribal territory of Ephraim. The tribe of Ephraim has a special bracha for wine, and I will lead this tour. We'll go to not only some of the important wineries, but also some of the very important historical sites that exist, next to these wineries, close to these wineries. It'll be more than just wine tasting, and Rudy will most likely tag along. And another option, if you're interested, for that same $360 monthly donation is a private night out, either in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem with Rudy. And by the way, this picture is not from Tel Aviv, and it's not from Jerusalem. This picture is actually from Cuba, solidarity. And I'll probably tag along. If you go out with Rudy one night in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, I'll probably come too. And Rudy's invited, of course, on the wine tour. And both of us, for those who are willing to donate $540 a month to the movement, will get a dual narrative tour of Hebron with Rudy and me, complete with security, complete with lunch, complete with transportation. You will meet with local Jews, you will meet with local Palestinians, and you will come out of this tour. And you can bring as many friends and family members as you want. Like, you tell me you want to bring 100 people, you bring 100 people. You want to bring 20 people, you bring 20 people. You want to come alone, come alone. But you and all the other participants will come out of this experience really deeply understanding not only the Palestinian narrative, not only the Israeli narrative, specifically the Hebronite Jewish narrative, but also, if we do our jobs right, you'll be able to transcend the narratives and create a bigger story that's inclusive enough to encompass both ostensibly rival stories, because that is how paradoxical logic works. That is how authentic Hebrew knowledge works. It's not Aristotelian, it's not dualistic, it's not either we're right or they're right, but it's a bigger story where we can all be right. I urge you to really take advantage of that opportunity and come to Hebron with us and experience it through the paradigm of paradoxical logic, the authentic Hebrew logic. Now, if you act fast, you will get a bonus, which basically means that whatever contribution you make, you will receive all of the other bonuses up to that contribution. Meaning, if somebody wants the night out in Tel Aviv with Rudy and wants to pay $300 or Jerusalem or the wine tour with me, they will not only get that, but they will also get the sweatshirt, and they will also get the book, and they will also get the weekly class, and they will also get the PDF, etc. So that's for those who want to, right away contribute and take advantage of that kind of bigger grab. And the way to contribute is through the button in the chat window. Basically, what you do is you go to our PayPal, you type in the amount you'd like to contribute, you click the box that says make this a monthly donation, and that's how it works, right? You choose PayPal, you choose debit or credit, and that's a way that you can support the Vision movement, which is really important because we do need your support in spreading these ideas. There's no other movement in the Jewish world today that are spreading these ideas, not only spreading these ideas, but applying these concepts to the Jewish reality, which is so important in terms of advancing Jewish history forward. So now we are back to our regularly scheduled program. We're talking about Jewish decolonization efforts. Like, okay, we talked about how the Jewish people have been colonized. Now let's talk about how we've attempted to decolonize, okay? So efforts to return. Now keep in mind, by the way, that picture, that statue we're looking at, That is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, author of the Kuzari. The Gaon of Vilna teaches us that the ideology of the Jewish people is found in the Kuzari. If you want to understand the worldview of the ancient Hebrews, you learn the Kuzari. That is the author, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. And the theme of Jewish life all over the world for many centuries was this idea that we would go home, we would return, we would attain political independence in Jerusalem. This was really the theme of Jewish life until the Haskalah. And throughout the centuries, there were continuous attempts by specific scholars to teach a more holistic Torah. Rabbi Yehuda Levi being one of them, the Ramban being one of them, the Ramchal, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Yalkut Shimoni, the Maharal of Prague, the Gaon of Vilna, Rav Kook, and these giants kind of maintained this holistic Torah that also cared about the national components and territorial components and historic mission and meta-narrative of the Hebrews, even if it wasn't practical. And unfortunately, when it's not practical, most people didn't get it, most people didn't connect to it, so it kind of remained the exclusive property of these giants of Torah. And in addition to these giants trying to teach this holistic Torah, there were several very practical Jewish liberation movements over the centuries that really attempted to restore Jewish independence to Palestine. And that's also really important to keep in mind, that it wasn't like there was Bar Kokhba, exile, and then fast forward, 1800 years, and you have Herzl. There were, between Bar Kokhba and Herzl, there was a chain of liberation movements, one after the other, all trying to restore Hebrew independence to the land of Israel, and all unfortunately failing until Zionism came along, which brings us to Zionism. Zionism is really the real decolonization of the Jewish people. I think that we often take for granted Jewish national consciousness, this idea today that we're part of a collective people. That idea was lost to us essentially at the time of the Haskalah. We started to relate to ourselves as Germans with a Jewish religion, Frenchmen with a Jewish religion, Englishmen with a Jewish religion. One of the most important contributions, I think, of Benjamin Ze'ev Herzl and the Zionist movement was to remind us that we're a people, that we're a collective, that we're brothers and sisters. And that's really important in terms of just promoting Jewish national consciousness. But beyond that, Zionism also succeeded in doing things that none of these other Jewish liberation movements were successful doing, in gathering a broken and scattered people back from the four corners of the world to the land we had been displaced from. Returning the Jewish people to agricultural work, manual labor, it's huge. At least in Europe, Jews had no connection to these things. Reviving the Hebrew language, right? Like there's no other people in history that has revived their dead language. Others have tried, but Am Yisrael did it. Building the infrastructure for a state, creating a military force, an anti-British colonial struggle an anti-colonial struggle against the British for independence. Although those who really led that struggle, the fighters for the freedom of Israel, and those who want to know more about it should, read the first tithe. They didn't define themselves as Zionists so much, but I think, we can broadly paint them, kind of categorize them within the Zionist camp for the purpose of this conversation. And then ultimately the liberation of Jerusalem, right? These are things that, Zionism achieved, and that's huge. These goals are goals that no other Jewish liberation movement before Zionism really succeeded at doing. So we have to give credit where credit is due.
It's important to also understand that in intellectual conversations and in political conversations, especially on the campus level, a lot of people say, oh, well, Herzl and Zionism is only about 100 years old, so your movement is very new and is European. Well, like you just discussed, there have been many movements that sought to bring the Jewish people back. The only reason that we know about Zionism for the most part is because the Zionism is the one that succeeded in doing so. But there were many movements that existed in order to bring us back that started from the moment that we were displaced. And the ideas of Zionism isn't something new. just the coinage of the word and put into practice with its flaws, because there were many flaws to Zionism, which is a conversation we need to have today of to how to undo those problems that exist. But the movement of Zionism was the finalization of a ambition that we had when we were displaced from our land, and with the aspiration of coming back home to that land. And it didn't start with Herzl, and it didn't start with the coinage of the term Zionism.
Right. No, it's a link, and it has to be remembered. It's a link in a chain. It's a link in a chain of Jewish liberation going back thousands of years, but Zionism happened to be the movement that was successful. But we also have to address the criticisms. Meaning it's such a huge, successful movement, has to have some flaws, has to make some kind of mess. So let's kind of relate to what the critics are seeing. Like when we talk about the critics of Zionism, whether they're at Columbia University, whether they're at other universities, whether they're in different communities throughout the world, what do they actually see? And, some of the words that get thrown around, for example, we discussed settler colonialism early in our webinar. And usually the way settler colonialism works is that there's like a mother country, the empire, or the colonial power that dispatches settlers to colonize a territory. That's usually how settler colonialism works. And certainly in the case of Zionism, there was no mother country that dispatched, the Zionists to settle Palestine. But I think the way it's seen by a lot of Israel's critics is that the national institutions and a lot of Jewish philanthropists in the diaspora who were supporting Zionism kind of took the place, like the Jewish communities themselves almost took the place of the colonial power. That's the way it's constructed. I don't think it really holds water. I think it's also important to relate to this idea of the Orientalization of Palestinians and Mizrahi Jews. The Jews who led the Zionist movement were, for the most part, Ashkenazim, who were the most part the Jews who experienced the colonization and the trauma that we have been talking about up till now, and who went through really, really, really severe trauma, severe persecution, and several layers of colonization. And I think, and we were Orientalized in Europe. We were what was called Halb-Asian in the medieval ages, which was kind of like half Asian. That's kind of how Europeans related to us. But one of the things that we did, one of the things that the Zionist leaders did when we came back to our land was we started to kind of Orientalize not only the Arabs who are living here, but also many Jews from Arab lands who are coming back or who are already here. And it kind of, I don't want to say appropriation, because we definitely related to the Mizrahi Jews as our brothers. Like, these were our people. This was a reunion. Like, we definitely saw it in that context. But I think that the Zionist leaders also kind of like romanticized Mizrahi culture in a very Orientalist way, and created institutions and created a society in which it was easier for Ashkenazim to succeed, like meaning institutions like the Technion, institutions like a Hebrew university, or the way things were structured, or the way the society, the values of the society were all according to the values, the culture, the experiences that Ashkenazi Zionists were coming with, were in many cases alien to Mizrahim, and they were included in it. I think that Mizrahim were granted inclusion in a way Palestinians were not. But still, I think they were kind of set up to not be able to succeed. Maybe not intentionally. I don't know if anybody was like thinking about this, but they were set up because the dominant institutions were definitely institutions that Ashkenazim had experiences with, similar to certain institutions in Europe. One maybe example is that the Ashkenazim had already for quite a few centuries not taken more than one wife, but some of the Mizrahim who came back to Israel, around this time came with more than one wife, and the Ashkenazim right away banned it. Whether right or wrong, this was an example of certain Jews coming from a certain diaspora with certain values and culture they picked up there, saying to other Jews coming from somewhere else, what you're doing is wrong, what you're doing is primitive, that's not the kind of society we're creating. And there is no real inclusion at the leadership level where Mizrahim got to steer the ship in the way that the Ashkenazi Zionists were able to steer it.
I think one example that's very relevant to even what's happening right now is the way that we created our political system, where we never had a conversation in 1948 as to what is a true system that works for the Hebrews, for the Jews, for the Israelites that have now come back and revived their civilization, something that works for us, but also addresses the circumstances that we're in today, and also taking into consideration the other populations that exist, like the Palestinians, like the Druzim, like the Bedouin, like the Cherkessim, like the Armenians that all exist within Israel today. What kind of system can we create that allows them to feel a part of our civilization, feel that this is their civilization as well, that allows us to fulfill our aspirations, that deals with the problems that we're currently dealing with, also with an outlook of the future problems that we might deal with in the future. We never had this conversation. We basically took the British parliamentary system that existed, a European system, and we changed the decorations, put Jewish decorations. We changed the language and put it to Hebrew. We changed the flag and put a Israel flag. And we never really had a conversation of decompressing and understanding, okay, now that we're back home, yes, we might have had all these experiences. And yes, the vast majority of those that are currently in power had the experience in Europe. We shouldn't see ourselves as an extension of Europe coming back home, because that's why other people will then experience us as Europeans vis-a-vis, instead of experiencing us as actually the natives coming back home. And we never had that conversation, and there are many things that come with it. I mean, we were in war the first day that we came back, and even before that, so we didn't really have the time to have that conversation. A lot of Jews had just come out of the Holocaust. A lot of Jews that were now coming in from North Africa and Middle Eastern countries were being persecuted, and we didn't really have that luxury to have that conversation, but we do have that luxury today. And we clearly see, even though Bibi finally was able to create a government and a coalition, we don't know how long that will last, but we see how in the past year plus, we haven't had a government. So clearly this system is not a system that works in Israel. And we have to find a system that works, that is both authentic to who we are, that fulfills our aspirations, but allows also other populations that exist within Israel to see the civilization as their own, and for one not to contradict the other.
Right. No, absolutely. And there are other things that people see as well when they look at Israel, they look at Zionism. There are things they see, and we need to be sensitive to these things. We need to be aware of all of these issues, like colonial structures of domination, meaning the way Israel rules Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, is not the way a native people, experiences independence in its homeland. It really resembles, it really looks like the structures really are structures of colonial rule. Also the monopolization of resources like water, for example, even the Oslo Accords, which obviously I'm against and Rudy's against, but when you look at the Oslo Accords, written into the agreement is Israeli domination over water from a place that we claim you're going to give away and would be their country. So you can't really have it both ways. And that's without even getting into things like separate laws based on ethnicity and religious identity, and I think the main issue is Israel acting as a tool of U.S. empire. I think for a lot of people, Israel is perceived as acting as a tool for American empire. And these are all criticisms we have to address. And it's important we don't react to them with defensiveness. I think these are all things we have to think deeply about, because all of these things are really expressions of our own colonization and part of our decolonization process. And I think, I would say it this way. I think that a lot of these accusations, a lot of these criticisms could be useful in helping us to decolonize ourselves. So that really brings us to this issue of Jewish decolonization today. And we should really start with this idea of a post-colonial conversation. As Rudy mentioned before, what makes a state Jewish? Is it just, a European-style nation state with some Jewish decorations? Or is it a state that expresses our identity in its policies and its institutions? And the metaphor I like to give is let's pretend that when you're 12 years old, some invaders take over your house from Japan. Invaders from Japan take over your house. They rearrange your furniture. They force you to eat Japanese cuisine. You have to eat sushi all the time, and you have to listen to Japanese music. The music you listened to before is outlawed. The cuisine you had before is outlawed. You don't like it, but they have guns. Nothing you can do. You're 12 years old. 5 years go by. You're 17 now. You've had enough. You decide to fight to free your home, and you win. They're gone. The Japanese are gone. Your home is free. But now you have to have a conversation. Where did the furniture used to be? And do I want to put it back or do I not want to put it back? That's part of the conversation too, acknowledging that things were changed. Like all of the things that we acknowledged, today in this webinar, they're not necessarily inferring we have to go back, but we have to have the conversation. We have to know what happened to us. We have to know what changed when and what the ramifications are for who we are, what our identity is, how we see ourselves, etc. So where did the furniture used to be? Do we want to put it back? Do we not want to put it back? Do we want to partially put it back? Do we like eating sushi? It's good for us. I like sushi. Rudy, you like sushi?
Love sushi.
Sushi. I honestly, I would eat sushi every day. If I had the choice, if I had the ability, I would eat sushi at least one meal a day.
I don't know about that.
I would. That's how much I enjoy it. And it's one of the tastiest things that my wife lets me eat. So I would really eat sushi once a day if I could. But in this situation, sushi is the cuisine of the oppressor. It was forced on me. It's part of my oppression. It's part of my colonization. Do I want to keep eating sushi? Or do I want to reject sushi and go back to the food I was eating before? Do I want to listen to Japanese music? Remember, they forced it on me. But at the same time, if I was 12 when they came in and I'm 17 now, that means a lot of my coming of age experiences took place against the backdrop of that soundtrack. Meaning when I hear those Japanese songs, I remember certain important events from my adolescence. And it's nostalgic. So, that's the post-colonial conversation, really, having this conversation over what is my identity? How much do I retain these features of colonization, the ones I like? How much do I want to go back to the way things were before? Is there a synthesis? And for everybody, it's different, by the way. Not everybody has to, decolonize in the same way. But we have to have these conversations. I think the Jewish people, I think one of the goals of Jewish liberation in this generation, and this is why the Vision movement is so active in promoting this conversation, we have to have the post-colonial conversation. For Israel to be able to move forward, for the Jewish people to be able to move forward, we have to have post-colonial conversation. What makes a state Jewish? What are we trying to create here? And we don't have to all agree, but just like the frictions between the rival ideological tendencies within Zionism actually led to a lot of advancement, tremendous advancement. The friction created by the different conclusions we all come to in this conversation can propel us forward. That's really important. Now, we have to also internalize and address the tochacha, the rebuke. I would say tochacha, by the way, in Hebrew, it means rebuke, the criticism. So when we talk about the criticisms of our enemies, we really have to be able to internalize that criticism. That is the healthy Jewish response to criticism, not defensiveness, but internalization, introspection. And again, the goal is to turn the caterpillar that is the state of Israel into a butterfly. That's what we're here to do. That's part of the work we're doing with decolonization. So just thinking about some of the criticisms that we hear against Zionism and against the state of Israel, I would say that it's really important we adopt an independent national posture. We don't want anyone to confuse us with a vassal of American power, as an extension of American power. We want to be an independent nation on our own, with our own value system, our own independent foreign policy.
Or an extension of Europe. We're still playing basketball and soccer in European leagues. We're still competing in the Eurovision. And yes, we should compete in competitions, but we should compete in them in our region. We're in the Middle East. We're Middle Eastern peoples. And that doesn't mean there's something wrong with Europe. We're just not Europeans. Right. And it's part of the conversation. And I think when I look at myself as to how I became someone that is an activist for Israel, gone through the college campuses, a large part of the things that started for me, beyond just the questioning of who I am through the anti-Semitic experiences, I would go when I was in middle school and high school to the AIPAC policy conference. Now, of course, There are many things that AIPAC does that we disagree with, such as push for a two-state solution, such as push for the aid that is pushed onto Israel, which causes Israel to be completely dependent on the U.S. However, every time that I would go to these conferences, I would hear the same speech over and over. A good Israel is a strong America. A strong America is a good Israel. And like they were saying the same thing every single year and nothing really of substance. So one year I decided to go outside and to hear what the protesters are saying. And I started to have conversations with them. And I became aware of all sorts of narratives that I had never heard before, which caused me to then go and dig deeper into my own history, dig deeper into my own identity, and try to understand, who are the Palestinians and what are they suffering from, and what is a lie and what is not a lie, and what is a truth but is being manipulated in order to push a different agenda. But there is a layer of truth to it. So Palestinians do exist, and they are suffering from the status quo. That status quo shouldn't be blamed on Israel, because Israel is not responsible for the consequences that were committed by the wars waged on Israel. However, Israel today does have more power than the Palestinians, so we should be using that power in order to change the status quo. And it's a conversation that you can find the answers when engaging with those that oppose you. And there is a truth to criticism that forces you to dig deeper within yourself to find the truth. And when you do find the truth, then there will be no more criticism. So I think that our relationship as Hebrews, we need to understand that when criticism is posed against us, it's not necessarily to only fight back. Like, yes, sometimes we should expose lies because something false is being told about us, and we need to set the record straight and narrate our story in our own way. But sometimes to use that criticism to force us to dig deeper and to find the greater truth and what kind of world that we want to create both for ourselves and those around us.
Right. No, I think it's important that we really think about what indigenizing also into the region means. Solidarity with other indigenous peoples, more deeply connecting to our roots, genuine engagement with Palestinians, like real engagement. I'm not talking about diplomats signing American pieces of paper, but like real engagement at the grassroots level, which both Rudy and I are very involved in. And really unpacking the national and territorial components of Jewish identity to create authentic Hebrew structures for organizing society, being inclusive of different identities, living as natives on our land. These are all really, really, really important ways we can use the criticisms of our critics to come and like as tools of our own liberation, to really go deeper into who we are, return to our roots. And I think we always believed, like we always told ourselves that even though we were, focusing on the spiritual, ritual, legal components of our identity, we would come back to our land and unpack the other parts. We have to talk about what makes an economy Jewish in the 21st century. What makes a healthcare system Jewish? What makes minority rights Jewish? What do minority rights look like in a Jewish society? What does a banking system look like? Do banks charge interest or do banks not charge interest? Should Shemitah have socioeconomic ramifications for our society? Like, these are questions we really have to address. And by the way, I would urge another way, we spoke before about donating financially to the Vision movement, which is of course very important, but other ways people can get involved is just go to Vision magazine, visionmag.org, and, sharing articles. And if people are interested in writing, or sharing content on Vision Mag, that's
sharing
also
knowledge, sharing information, speaking to those around you, your friends, your family, those in your community, seeing a problem that exists around you. And it's not even only in a Jewish way, in any way. That's the purpose of Am Yisrael, is to spread light, both as individuals and as a collective. And I think for the most part, we see throughout history, we see many bright stars that are Jews, secular and religious, Einstein and Freud and many individuals, but we haven't yet done that as a collective unit, right? We haven't yet united together and found out what is this nation. Yeah, we might have our individual mission statement, might have our family mission statement, but what is our civilization's mission statement? And it's along the lines of Tikkun Olam and Or Lagoim, to be a light upon others, other nations, and to help make the world a better place. And what does that mean? And that, again, is not something that we're trying to push an answer for. We're trying to bring that to the conversation of pop culture, because unfortunately, a lot of the diaspora Jews, historically, but also within Israel today, we're not having that conversation. Everyone is fed up with the status quo and the situation, but instead of turning your head away and walking away, you have to face the problem and actually have a real conversation to create something better than what exists. And that is the purpose of a Jew, to wrestle with these concepts, to wrestle with the problems in order to achieve and to go up and find that greater truth, which is the name Israel.
Exactly. And we spoke before about Zionism being material decolonization. We also now have to focus on ideological decolonization, something the Hasmonean kingdom never did. That was the failure of the Maccabean revolt, that it didn't engage in ideological decolonization once the land was free. So we need to return to paradoxical logic. And I think that's where the solution, like I said before, when we spoke about the dual narrative tour of Hebron, I think that's where the secret to peace with the Palestinian really lies, paradoxical logic. In fact, I remember from my own experience, I wasn't able to understand the Palestinian perspective or the Palestinian narrative until I learned paradoxical logic, until I learned to look at the world through an authentically Hebrew worldview, and suddenly there became space for the other, without compromising on my own identity or my own aspirations or my own people's rights or my own connection to my land. I'm obviously against giving up any land. I'm obviously against dividing the land of Israel. I'm obviously against compromising in the Jewish culture of the country. But yet, I want to correct the injustices that were done to Palestinians in the process of our material decolonization. So paradoxical logic is key to being able to simultaneously hold those two truths and transcend the ostensible opposites and get past the generic narratives. So if anybody's interested in learning more about paradoxical logic, please be in touch. Please contact us, and we can share videos and texts, etc. Also, like Rudy said before, we need to express our identity in the policies and institutions of our state. But we have to do it in a way that's much more deeply Jewish than what we're doing right now, but also softly Jewish. Right now, the Jewish character of our state is very shallow, but very hard. And I think it's too shallow for Haredim, and Haredim are important because of the fastest growing population between the river and the sea. But Palestinians are also important, and the state's too Jewish for them. So the problem is the Jewishness of the state is hard and shallow. We need to make it deep and soft. So the average Haredi child sees the Jewishness of the state in every policy, every institution, and the average non-Jew doesn't even notice it's a Jewish state half the time, because it's just like permeating society in a way that works for him. Also, I think, going back to our calendar, our economic model. By the way, I'd also say our name structures. That's something, by the way, if anybody's interested in learning more, I see that people who are still here after 2 hours are obviously interested in this topic. So one of the things I would really urge you guys to do is, if you go to Vision Magazine, you can find, we have a podcast there called The Next Stage. It's also, it's SoundCloud and iTunes and all the relevant platforms. There's an episode, I think it's the 8th episode. It's called Decolonizing Jewish Identity. It's me and my wife, Sharona Eshet Cohen. And one of the issues we talk about in that podcast is name structures. Because a lot of people make aliyah. Let's say a guy named Sam decides to make aliyah, and he comes here, and now he's Shmuel. Before he was Sam Goldstein, and now he's Shmuel Goldstein, right? That's Hebraizing his name. But there's Hebraizing the name and Hebraizing the name structure. This idea, by the way, of having a private name followed by a family name is a very Western social construct. And it's not the way name structures work in our society. I'm Yehuda HaKohen. My wife is Sharona Eshet Cohen. I'm the Kohen. On my mountain, I'm the Kohen. That's who I am. If I came from Jerusalem and I moved here and I wasn't a Kohen, maybe they'd call me Yehuda Yerushalmi. Or if I came from Beit Lechem, they'd call me Yehuda Beit Halachmi. Or if I was the son of a guy named Moshe, they'd call me Ben Moshe, right? Like, that's the way name structures are fluid in Hebrew civilization. Like, you can be known as the Kohen or the Levi in one place, or the Sofer, or the truck driver, or the doctor, or whatever your role is in your community. You could be known by that title, and if you move somewhere else, you might be known as where you're from, because they have a lot of doctors there, and you being a doctor doesn't make you unique. So I think there's levels and levels of decolonization, just like we have layers of colonization, there's layers of decolonization. So it's something also to think about, how far every individual is really willing to go. Obviously, I'm a little bit of a radical. I go pretty far. My wife is even more of a radical. She goes even further. But everybody at their own level will decide like how much they want to personally decolonize, how much their community should decolonize. But it's an important conversation to have. I also think, just trying to think about priorities and values and the way we prioritize values. Do we put the material well-being of the individual at the center, or do we put the moral well-being of the collective at the center? Just like think about different issues in society, think about different things being debated politically, and ask yourself, like, what's more important, the material well-being of the individual in the situation or the moral well-being of the collective? Something to think about. Also, a more Hebrew relationship with nature, with the natural world, Eretz Yisrael specifically. How do we treat the environment? How do we treat the planet? If we relate to the planet as being one with us, as sharing a soul with us, we would treat it differently. Just go watch the Lorax. You'll see. Like it's not a very complicated issue, and of course, part of ideological decolonization is using the material conditions created by Zionism, created by the successes of the Zionist movement, to advance the ancient Hebrew mission. That's really important. Advance Jewish history to the next stage. There is a question that often comes up that I do want to address. People ask, what is the relationship between Jewish decolonization and tshuva? And this idea of like returning to Orthodox Judaism. Because we said earlier that, Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, Reform Judaism, are all colonized aspects of our identity. So a lot of what we're talking about, and maybe even like a lot of this webinar, might have sounded like we're advocating for a return to Orthodox Judaism in the same way you might hear from Eshet Torah or Chabad, etc. That's not what's going on here. I would actually argue, I would say on the one hand, yes, this thing called Orthodox Judaism is a relatively recent social construct. It's not the authentic way of being a Hebrew. But I will say that what we call Orthodox Judaism did preserve certain aspects of our identity, the ritual aspects, the legal components, spiritual, to a certain extent, spiritual components. And so therefore, there might be overlap sometimes between like a decolonized Hebrew and an Orthodox Jew. But I would also argue that the concept of tshuva, the Hebrew concept of tshuva, is actually closer to decolonization than it is to adopting an Orthodox Jewish lifestyle. Meaning it can't be limited by this idea of becoming an Orthodox Jew, because there's so much more to our identity beyond where the Orthodox Jews are willing to go. So we need to be, obviously in the 21st century, expressing the values and aspirations and participating in accomplishing the mission of our ancestors, but not in a colonized way, in my opinion. I mean, everybody makes their own decision, but I think that this can't be confused with just going back to like the limited, small Judaism of Poland. We're back in our land, we're recreating Hebrew civilization, and when we have these conversations, we need to think about how Jewish identity is expressed in the military, in the economy, in government, in commerce, in sanitation, in transportation, in every facet of national existence. That's what this is about. And some conversations or questions I want to leave you guys with, just because these are questions that, I think we all struggle with in the vision movement. There are many ideas, many agreements, many disagreements on some of these questions. Do you think, and we're interested in hearing what you think, do you think that Israel can one day return to things like prophecy, nevuah, to the spiritual experience of oneness? Remember, we said that our ancestors had a spiritual experience, not just a spiritual worldview, but an experience. Can we return to that experience? Are we going to return to temple services? There are definitely a lot of people in Israeli society who believe that this whole project of returning to our land is ultimately going to get to the temple and to korbanot. You guys see that happening? What about updated Hebrew systems of government? Are we going to see a melech again? Or are we going to maintain the governmental system we have now? Or are we going to have something in between, something that might be a more modern form of government that expresses the values and identity of the ancient Hebrews? These are all questions to think about. I'm not sure I have all the answers. Rudy, I don't know how much you've really developed your ideas on the subject, but I think these are ongoing conversations within the movement that are interesting, and we definitely invite everybody to engage in that. So what do you think? You guys writing in the chat?
So how are we going to do these questions? Because I saw that some of them were highlighted. I believe they were highlighted by Donit.
I didn't see that.
If you go on the chat and you go down, some of them are highlighted in red.
Oh, yeah? Okay,
Yeah.
so let's take a look. For some reason, I'm not seeing any highlighted questions.
Do you if you're on the chat and you scroll up and down, you should see some of them being.
Okay, I got one. Okay, Chris asked what a purely Jewish athletic sport is. I'm not sure why Donate chose to highlight that, but what? All questions are highlighted?
No.
Oh, all questions are highlighted. Okay, do you have a response to that? Can you think of an authentic Hebrew sport?
Maybe a slingshot.
He doesn't want people to just say arguing, debating, because that is probably an authentic Jewish sport. Just arguing. We do that a lot.
Debate class.
Yeah.
I don't know, a physical sport. Maybe that's an element of our culture that was lost. There are definitely musical instruments that are indigenous to our culture. There are definitely foods that are native to our culture. Sports, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure about that question. We'll have to dig deeper and try to find.
Right. The truth is, sports for the sake of sports. I don't mean exercise. Exercise is important. Being in good physical shape is important. In fact, according to Rav Kook, that's a very, very central element of tshuva. It's called tshuva tiv'it. We have to be in good physical shape. We have to exercise. We have to use our bodies properly. We have to eat right. If some of you guys smoke cigarettes, maybe think about quitting. But that doesn't mean like basketball or soccer are necessarily part of our identity. It doesn't mean they're bad, but they're not like what we call authentic Hebrew sports. Maybe archery. But I see there's another question here from Natalie. How would you say we can hear all the discussions about Gaza in a practical, knowledgeable way? I think when it comes to Gaza, I was part of the resistance in 2005 to the expulsion of the Jews from Gaza, us giving up Gaza, us losing Gaza. It was forced on us by George W. Bush. And for me, it was a traumatic experience. But I think that everything that's happened since, especially the Palestinians living in Gaza and also to many of the Jews in the south around Gaza, everything that's happened since is the result of that crime. And I don't think we're going to stop having the same stupid war every couple of years until we actually acknowledge we made a mistake. We have to go back. We have to dismantle Hamas. We have to rebuild the Jewish communities that were destroyed. And we have to offer the Palestinians in Gaza a better life with us than they have right now. That's easier said than done. I'm saying it like it's simple. It's not simple. This is something I've thought a lot about. I don't know how much Rudy's really thought about it. Rudy, you've been in Gaza, right? As a soldier, like I was there as a civilian.
No. No, I did not go into Gaza as a soldier. I got out of the army in 2013. In 2012, we had Operation Amud Anan, which we were on the border and preparing to go into Gaza, but we didn't actually go into. But I do remember when there was the disengagement of Gaza. I was much younger. I was either probably in middle school at the time or even in elementary still. And I wore the orange bracelets of those. That was the color of those supporting for Jews having a right to live there. Now, that doesn't mean over and other people. That just means we should be able to live there as well and to express our self-determination on our land. And again, I think the easier thing to accomplish, the easier thing to accomplish, I think, is resolving first Judea and Samaria, because I think that's an area with a lot more relations that exist on the ground where Jews already live there. They have relations with Palestinians, and I think that will be something that will be fixed before the situation in Gaza, and maybe through the solution that we eventually come to. Again, a solution will never be imposed. It is something that will be developed. And an analogy that you once gave that I think is very depicts the situation in a very good way is the analogy of the artist, right? But when you're an artist, you first pick a canvas, and then you pick the color, the texture of your canvas, the size of your canvas, then you pick your paintbrushes, and then you start to color, and then you mess up and you come up with a different idea, and eventually at the end you take a step back and you look at the image and you pick a frame that works for the painting. And to talk about a solution right now is imposing a frame before even having a conversation between those who are supposed to make up this painting, which isn't only the Jews, it's also those that exist in our land as well. Palestinians, they also exist in this land, and it's also a land that they connect to and they want to live in and they have aspirations, and so it's also in a way their land. So we have to create an image that works for all of us, and it's something that will be achieved, not a solution that will be imposed, something that we will work up to, and it's something that will eventually lead to the answer. I think another question that relates to this I saw is talking about Bibi as a prime minister and causing a lot of Israelis to flee and to go to Berlin, and how are we going to get someone else in power? Well, we don't really go into politics. We're not telling anyone how to vote or who to vote for, because we want everyone to vote for who they think should be prime minister. But another big problem is a lot of the population is just so disconnected to these issues, and the political system that exists forces individuals to compete with one another to take certain issues that are true, like for example, like we said before, security and identity. These are both real issues, and to hoard them to one side that is called the right, and then for the left to talk about humanity and justice and rights, and to hoard them and to take them onto the left, rather than allowing both of these ideas and these values to coexist and to find a greater truth. And what the system forces the politicians to do is to fight each other in order to remain in power. And with this 4-year reign of power, it causes politicians to think about how do we incorporate short-term solutions in order to then use those solutions to go back and to run again, rather than long-term solutions that help our population, all of us living on this ground, in this land, to move forward. And I think the way that we will eventually change the leaders that exist is by first empowering generations. One of my favorite quotes is that a true leader does not create more followers, they create more leaders. And we have to create a generation of leaders that is able to have this conversation, that is able to find all sorts of different answers that allow us to find that greater answer that is holistic, that includes all the different layers and different answers in order for us, again, to move forward. But there's not an immediate, like a lot of people when they talk about the conflict, they're like, what's your solution? What is the answer? Give me that answer, and if you don't satisfy me right away, then you're not the truth. And that's the problem, that we're not going to find the answer just by imposing it. We're going to find the answer by building up to it. That starts with being able to have conversations, being able to take criticism, being able to understand different perspectives and different ideologies and different histories and different experiences, and building relations and humanizing the other side. And those are things that are not being done. And taking down psychological walls. Eventually we need to take down the physical wall that exists within our land. And I think that's what you were talking about earlier, that we're acting almost as if we're colonizers in our land, although we're not, obviously, because we're the opposite of colonizers. We're the native population that decolonize our land by coming back. But why are we creating walls within our land? Those are things that colonizers do. So that's why a lot of people that are Palestinian, or those that are critics of Israel, kind of sometimes don't understand Israel, or misrepresent us, is because they experience us through actions that don't truly represent who we are. And again, that's part of this post-colonial conversation of decolonization. And something that wasn't asked but that I wanted to touch on earlier is a conversation that really often comes up in political discourse, especially on college campuses, but just in general in the intellectual spaces, about Jewish people being white. And what white means today in the intellectual space is not necessarily having a light pigmentation of skin, because there are very light-skinned people that are people of color, like Black people, right? They look white, but they're not white. And there are people that are Asian that look very white, but they're not considered white. So in the intellectual space, when they're talking about someone, what?
2 of my children have very light pigmentation.
Yeah, I mean, my father is a lot lighter than me. He has red hair and blue eyes, just like Melech David and other individuals within our history, and that's just to show that we always came up in a plethora of different colors. And my mom is darker than me, and so we came out two darker Sfaradi-looking brothers and two lighter brothers. And so this the fact that I have different eye colors and different features and different pigmentation that make me like is like, should we create a division? And the answer is no. But what does it mean today when someone is trying to say that someone is white? They're talking about status and they're talking about origins, and it's very important to understand that
being part of the dominant culture.
Right. And the origins of the Jewish people is not from Europe, which is what is considered to be the origins of being white, this European identity. Some of us, not all of us, some of us had an experience there. And that doesn't mean, and even while we were there, we were never considered white. In fact, why we were killed in the Holocaust is because we were not part of this Aryan race, this white race, but also the conversation about privilege. And a lot of people don't understand the struggles that the Jewish people go through in a white society, so they consider us white. But, the second that someone notices that you have a Magen David, or you have a Jewish name, or you're dressed modestly, or you have a kippah, or you have a beard, all of a sudden you're anti-Semitism is an experience in your life. And maybe we don't experience the same thing as we do when Black people experience racism, or people of color experience racism, because right away you can tell when someone is different, because the first thing that you see is the pigmentation of their skin. But for us, when we experience xenophobia, anti-Semitism in our way, it has sort of like levels and spikes, because we might be fine for a generation and for a month and for a week or for 2 years. But the second that we experience anti-Semitism, 6 million of us might die. And our experience with xenophobia in a white society should not be seen through the lens of an experience of another population. And so I would argue that we're not white, because when you're talking about someone being white, again, we're not talking about necessarily their pigmentation or skin. We're talking about their origins, and we're talking about their status and their experience. And their origins is not from Europe, it's from Judea or Middle Easterners, even Ashkenazi Jews, which are usually the lighter skinned Jews within the Jewish population, although there are many dark skinned Ashkenazi Jews. Their origins is not from Europe. And even genetically, like genetic tests show that Ashkenazi DNA is a particular DNA that, yes, might have existed for generations within Europe, but that stems from the Levant, that stems from the Middle East. And our experience, we were never considered white, and we're still not considered white. In fact, on college campuses, I don't see movements against Native Americans and Tibetans and Yazidis and Kurds and Black people, and that's normal, that's a good thing. But there are only movements against Jews and Jewish empowerment. So the strongest force today in the youth and in the intellectual spaces is the movements against the Jews. And Jews make up such a small population, but yet the amount of xenophobia, if you compare it in numbers, is greatly against Jews, and anti-Semitism is rampantly growing. So there is a conversation that we need to have, and the experience of Jews, although sometimes might be white passing, as it is for people of descent from Native Americans, that might be white passing, or people that might be Latin American from different cultures that might be white passing, but that doesn't make them white, because their status is not white. Their status comes from a collective which is not white, and their origins is not white either. And that's something that we need to clarify with the world, because if we cannot express ourselves in the right way, we can't expect everyone to understand who we are.
Right, but I think it's also important, I can even see by the comments, that we need to acknowledge that there is this thing today, this minute, regardless of the experience Jews had in European countries, because obviously we weren't included and we weren't white in European countries. It also has to be acknowledged that within the United States of America, Jews worked very hard, especially due to the trauma we experienced in Europe, and especially after World War II. Jews worked very hard to be included in what's called whiteness. And Jews were granted what I call limited inclusion. It's like we were conditional inclusion, but conditional inclusion is very different from having real white privilege, because to really be white in any society, or American society today, means you're not on probation, means it can't be taken away from you. And this is obviously a very complicated subject, but it's definitely true that there are Jews in Western civilization currently, in right now, who do benefit from white privilege. And I think, again, like, I'm going to plug the podcast one more time. The next stage, you can access it at Vision Magazine or all the platforms. There is one we did a couple weeks ago with actually with one of the trainers from If Not Now, Yutam Marom, on this idea of how anti-Semitism operates. The episode after that, by the way, is Rudy and I talking about Hebrew liberation today. So I encourage everybody to go to Vision Magazine, check out the podcast, The Next Stage, and you'll hear all about decolonizing Jewish identity, how anti-Semitism operates systemically, because that's an important conversation, and what this relationship between Jewish identity and whiteness is, because I think we have to acknowledge there has been a certain level of white privilege that Jews in America today enjoy, but we also have to acknowledge that it's not real. It's not like we're not the ones deciding who gets included. We're the ones who obtain limited inclusion. And somebody recently asked,
and only if we're like the good Jew that like puts their head down,
if we behave,
and behave and don't be true to who you are, and it's right. A slave, right? We just had Pesach that happened, and the goals of coming back to Israel is not only physical but also mental, of freeing ourselves of these shackles that bound us to.
Someone asked the question if to decolonize means to make aliyah, and someone else, there's a really important question
mentally.
Now. Right.
Mental aliyah.
Well, no, but also geographic aliyah is, I think, an
eventually, yes. But first, starting with mental at the least.
I think Stacy asked the question, why decolonize at all? Like, what's the point of, she said, maybe I'm missing the point, but I'm trying to understand why decolonize at all? Why can't people just live? And I think that is a very popular sentiment, especially in like contemporary liberal Western civilization. I don't know how lasting it is, meaning I don't know, the world is changing rapidly. I don't know if you can just live anymore, but I will say that it's your choice, meaning no one is trying to force you to decolonize. We assume that anybody who is coming to this webinar is interested in the topic. Everybody should do it at their own pace, according to their own comfort level. No one should feel any pressure to decolonize in any direction. But I will say one reason, if you ask why decolonize at all, is because you should acknowledge that an injustice was perpetrated against you. And I think that we all have a drive to correct the injustices that are perpetrated against us. We want to correct crimes committed against us. And at the end of the day, it might come down to a level of sensitivity, how much do we really feel like that happened to us? How much do we really feel like we are that identity that this was done to? How much do I really identify with the Judean rebels who fought the Greek and Roman empires? How much do I identify with those who went to burn at the stake rather than accept Christianity? How much do I really identify, with all of our ancestors who fought, killed, and died for what was important to our people for thousands of years? And that's an individual question that we all have to really ask ourselves. And those of us who are sensitive to what happened to our people and want to correct it will probably find this decolonization discourse very useful and a very powerful tool. And we've had you guys here, really kol hakavod to the 50 people who are still here after more than 2.5 hours of this conversation. I really want to thank Rudy.
There is one question that I want to answer before we just wrap up that I really like. It's asked by Liad, and he asks, what are your views towards Jews with anti-Zionist sentiments? And first of all, we have to understand that when you're colonized, you don't know necessarily who you are. We also live in an age where there's so much misinformation. So a lot of Jews are told these horrible things about what it means to be truly empowered as a Jew and what Israel is. And so they come to conclusions just based on the information they have access to. And a lot of Jews coming to college campuses because they don't really know what it means to be a Jew and the history, and not all of them, but some of them. And they come to spaces where they want to be part of the left because the left is something that resonates more with them, where they care more about minority rights and liberations and justice. And they're told today that if you want to be a part of these movements, if you want to even be a part of our social circle on this college campus, then you must also be against Israel. And my perspective on Jews that become anti-Israel, I kind of relate it to a psychological term that is called the Stockholm Syndrome, which basically, if I can use an analogy, let's say you have a woman who's married to a very abusive husband, which is something horrible. There are 4 ways in which that woman can react to the situation. She can leave, she can fight back, She can make excuses for what's happening, or the worst of all is blame herself for her being the cause of this violence. And that's kind of the same thing we see happening today with the Jewish community. When anti-Semitism rises, and even some, you can say historically, you can leave, you can pack up and move to a different country, or you can move back to Israel. You can fight back mentally, ideologically, intellectually, and even physically, right? Which is usually the smallest population of Jews that do, at least in the past 2,000 years. You can pretend like nothing is going on, like a lot of Jews did as the Holocaust didn't happen overnight, right? It was a decade of anti-Semitism rising to the point that eventually we were just led into the gas chambers and just walked right in. But what were Jewish leaders saying at the time? Oh, don't worry, it'll just go away. And that's the same thing that I was hearing when I started being an activist. I started first school at Santa Monica College and UCLA, but most of my activism took place at UCLA, and the Jewish community, the leaders, the Hillels were saying, don't worry, that if you go and make noise, it'll just get worse. Just stay in your little Jewish bubble in your shtetl and just be pro-Israel with some hummus and some Omer Adam on the side, and that's what we need, and we'll be fine. What?
In the Hillel building, like inside the Hillel.
Yeah, in the Hillel building, or in the API building, or even in the Chabad, like just be afraid of who you are and hide your identity. And that's what a lot of people are doing. They're pretending like there's not really an issue. And then there's the other element of blaming yourself, for what your oppressor is doing, and feeling the need that you can only live if your oppressor tells you to live, and only jump if your oppressor tells you to jump. And that's a lot of Jews that become anti-Zionist. It's either from misinformation or falling in love with their oppressor, the Stockholm syndrome. And you can see that even from people that are really secular and on the left, or even very religious with Netorah Karta. And if you look at the ideologies of Netorah Karta, literally anything that empowers Am Yisrael, they're against. Even the revival of Hebrew. And one could say, yeah, maybe it's because a lot of this stuff was done by the Zionists and by the secular Jews at the time. But that's the thing, that we're all a part of Am Yisrael. We're all a part of the Jews, and we're these different tribes, and these different tribes are different in their own ways, and they have to keep their individuality like organs in a body, but we're also part of a collective. And if you reject an organ, then the body is sick. If you reject a tribe, then your nation falls apart, and we have to find a way to come together. But if you want to understand why Jews become anti-Israel, it's usually out of fear. It's usually out of misunderstanding and misinformation that they were taught. Sometimes it's because they feel no other choice. Maybe I like Israel, but if I support Israel openly, then I'm going to get hated. And if I turn my back on Israel, then, I'm going to get praise and I'm going to get friends. So sometimes people are selling out, and they're subconscious to them doing that. And, a lot of people say, oh, well, you need to just come back to Israel. But, there are a lot of Jews living in Israel that are mentally not in Israel, that don't understand what it means to be a part of Am Yisrael. So yes, we need to strive to one day come back home physically and do that. When we say Shana Haba b'Yerushalayim, it's not in the future in Jerusalem, it's next year in Jerusalem. But we also need to understand that it's not only a physical journey, it's also a mental one, of coming back to Israel mentally and understanding what that truly is as individuals and as a collective.
Right. I would like to offer a different answer to Liad, because I do have a different perspective than Rudy when it comes to Jews who are critics of Israel. And I don't mean the extreme examples like Netorah Karta. I also think there's a truth being expressed. Zionism did make a mess. Zionism was a really successful revolutionary movement that did all the things we talked about, this material decolonization, but it did make a mess, and there were people hurt, and these things have not been addressed yet. And I do understand how a Jew who feels that these things were done in his name or her name can want to work towards, correcting those injustices, and work towards correcting those injustices in a counterproductive way. And I think that's why it's really important that we provide, and we talk about, as we did, we talk about ways to actually decolonize Jewish identity and advance Jewish liberation in a way that simultaneously addressing a lot of the grievances of Palestinians, because that at least provides an avenue. It provides a path for those who don't want to betray the Jewish people, but at the same time feel pained by the fact that other humans were hurt in the process of our liberation. It provides a way to get involved without having to be on one side or the other or betray your own people. And I think that also I believe at this stage in our development, the national force, we've talked about this many times, not tonight, but we've talked about this many times in the past, the national and like the spiritual forces of the Am Yisrael have kind of gotten together, but we need that universal force as well. And I think a lot of the anti-Israel Jews on college campuses are really expressions of that force and representatives of that force. And we need to create space for them to kind of move forward with us in a way that advances Jewish liberation, alleviates Palestinian grievances, and creates a new reality in this country that could set an example of something new to the rest of humanity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, help us spread these ideas. Really, like, be part of this movement. Go to Vision Magazine. Listen to the podcast. Follow Rudy. Follow me. Get involved with the Vision movement. If you're a student on a university campus, help us bring our programs to your campus. Get people to sign up for the next webinar. If you're in a position to donate to the movement, please donate, because we do need your help. And of course, there are many bonuses you can access and obtain by making your contribution ASAP. Rudy, thank you so much. Really, thank you so much for giving almost 3 hours of your time for this. Thank you to the 50 people who are still here, 50 people in the audience who hung with us for almost 3 hours. You guys should really give yourselves a round of applause. I know some of you, but I don't know all of you, and I'm really, really grateful that you guys hung in there. This was a really important conversation. There was a lot of pressure on Rudy and I to cram it into an hour and 15 minutes. That did not happen. That wasn't going to happen. And I think everybody understands why that couldn't happen. But this is a really, really important conversation. And I really hope that we can continue with all you guys. I hope all of you have subscribed to the newsletter. If you go to visionmag.org, you can subscribe to the newsletter, and really feel free to be in touch with me, be in touch with Rudy, be in touch with the Vision Movement on all the platforms. And we look forward to working with you and moving forward together.
Yalla, stay strong.